A few years ago, a new horror concept cafe opened in my neighborhood. Excited, I went there with Levi and Owen, and when we went inside, there were statues larger than people depicting Dracula, Bigfoot, Frankenstein, aliens, etc., and voices were coming out of them. I approached the Dracula statue, and it spoke in a very scary voice.
Making a latte with blood is really delicious. Are you ready to have your blood harvested?
I ran away, and he laughed in a creepy voice. Because the statues were so large, I thought there were employees inside of them. We had so much fun, and we went to that cafe every day from that day on. But a few days later, Levi suddenly stopped replying to my messages, and when I went to his house, I found his parents crying. They told me that Levi had disappeared. We couldn't just sit around and do nothing, so Owen and I decided to search for Levi. We went to all the places he might be, and one of the places we went was that horror cafe. We went up to the statues and asked them if they had seen our friend named Levi. The first 3 statues responded that they had not seen him, but then the Frankenstein statue spoke.
I saw him.
We asked Frankenstein where Levi was, but he gave no further answers. But the alien statue suddenly shouted, I miss my planet. Owen and I looked at each other at the same time because the voice coming from the statue sounded like Levi's voice. I walked up to the alien statue and said, Levi, is that you? My voice trembling in fear. The statue replied, Mom is waiting for me on planet Kepler 186. I have to go back. Our eyes widened and jaws dropped because we realized it was definitely Levi's voice. We asked him to come out, asking him what he was doing in there, but he just kept saying strange things. A few days ago, a fat earthling kidnapped me. Earthlings are so scary. After a bit, he went quiet, and with no one else around, it was completely silent. We wondered what to do. Owen and I went home, but went back to the cafe the next day and approached the alien statue again. And at first, we couldn't hear anything inside. I spoke to the statue, Levi? And heard a very small voice inside. Yes, I'm Levi. Get me out of here. I'm so sick right now. It was Levi's voice, whispering very softly. When I asked him how to get out, he whispered, Tell the cafe owner that you want to go inside the statue. So I told the cafe owner, and he readily agreed to my request. I sent Owen a text asking him to report it to the police immediately if he loses contact with me. The cafe owner led me to the basement where there was a secret area where I could enter the statues. The cafe owner made me go inside the Bigfoot statue. As soon as I entered the statue, the smell of blood overwhelmed me. I could see people walking around in the cafe through the small holes in front of me, but at that moment, I heard a sound and the door locked from the bottom. I realized that it was the cafe owner who locked the door from below, and he said to me,
From now on, you're my employee. If you act well, cafe sales will increase, right? But if your voice doesn't sound like Bigfoot, I'm going to stab you with this spear of punishment.
There were openings on the floor where I was standing, and I could see the tip of a spear in an opening. I panicked. He continued speaking.
Come on, try your Bigfoot voice. This spear will judge you on how good you are.
The spear tip was very large and covered in blood. I was so scared that I wet myself. Urine dripped through my clothes and onto his spear, and he laughed wildly. I was trapped inside the statue, and when people in the cafe spoke to me, I forced myself to act and respond. Then Owen came up and asked the statue, Mr. Bigfoot, have you seen my friend? So I told him, Your friend is in my body right now because I swallowed him alive. I wanted to ask Owen to save me, but the cafe owner was watching from below with the spear, so I had no choice but to act. I watched with dread as Owen walked outside. I was afraid he wouldn't come back. But after a while, I could faintly hear police sirens, and police officers came into the cafe. Owen had called the police. Eventually, after searching the inside of the cafe, the police came down to the basement. When the police came nearby, I screamed, and I could hear screams coming from the other statues as well. Eventually, the cafe owner's secret area was discovered. People were trapped inside the statues, and as they were rescued, they cried and said they had been trapped inside for dozens of days. We were all released. All of the people who were trapped had rips in their clothes and were covered in bloodstains. I frantically searched, but no matter how much I looked, I couldn't see Levi. I shouted at the cafe owner who was wearing handcuffs, "Where is Levi?" He replied,
He was so bad at acting as an alien, so I stabbed him with my spear.
Eventually, the police searched further into the basement and found Levi's body, stabbed to death with wounds matching the cafe owner's spear. 5 years have passed now, but I still have nightmares of being trapped inside that statue and having my body pierced by a spear. This is a terrible incident that happened to me after I performed a devil summoning ritual with my best friend Austin. The reason why I'm sharing this story, which has been buried in my heart for a long time, is to warn all humans that no one should ever summon the devil. Devils are 100 times more cruel, terrible, and powerful than humans. One day, 7 years ago, when Austin and I were teenagers, we discovered how to summon devils on the internet. And like fools, we actually tried it. At the time, I did not know that we were actually opening the gates of hell. It all started when Austin began to chant a spell, but after a while, he suddenly screamed and grabbed his stomach. Then I saw something bulging and moving in his stomach. Austin screamed for help, saying there was something in his stomach. The skin on his abdomen protruded as if it were about to be torn, and a monstrous voice came from inside his body.
"Hello, friends."
Then Austin started gagging, and something like a red tail came out of his mouth. I thought I was hallucinating. Austin said there was a devil in his stomach, and he asked for a knife to stab himself in the stomach. Before he could do it, his mother came into the room, having heard his scream. Somehow, Austin suddenly felt fine, and he said he couldn't feel anything in his stomach now. I explained to his mother what happened, but she didn't believe me. I went home after that and was scared all night. The next day, I got a call from Austin, and he asked me to come to his house. I went to his house, and he seemed unexpectedly fine. When I asked him what happened, he just laughed. I noticed that his tongue was split in two. Then he came closer to me. His breath was hot and smelled of sulfur, so I was startled and took a step back. He blew a stream of air at me. The air was burning hot. I moved away from it and fell back, covering my face with my hands. I saw that the clothes on my arm where his breath had touched them were burned. Smoke was coming out of his mouth as if his insides were burning. He took a deep breath like he was trying to blow again. At that moment, I knew that if his breath touched me, I would be in big trouble. So I kicked him hard in the stomach and ran away. I ran outside and called him. He answered his phone, and when I asked him, "What the hell is going on?" he answered in a monstrous voice.
"Hell is happening. What does the devil do? It destroys, hurts, and kills God's creatures."
I told him we didn't mean to do this and begged him to go back. He just laughed at me and said,
"I just got here and you're telling me to go back? I feel sad. I'm going to play with you and this guy for a very long time."
I cried and begged for forgiveness, but all I could hear was the monster's laugh coming from the phone. I was so scared that I hung up the phone. After that, I had no contact with Austin for a while. A few days passed like that. Then one night, I got a call from an unknown number, and when I answered it, it was Austin's mother. She told me, sobbing, Austin. She sounded like she was out of breath. What she said after a while was so shocking that I threw up. She said Austin was found dead in his room. However, Austin's entire body was burned, and his mouth was badly torn. She didn't know what happened. The police came and investigated, but there was no sign that anyone had broken into Austin's room. The only thing that was clear was that Austin's throat was ripped open. What was even more creepy was that there were bloodstains and a small child's footprints all the way from Austin to the window, but the police were never able to figure out whose footprints they were. I wasn't sure exactly what happened to Austin, but I knew it was the devil's doing. But I couldn't tell anyone what happened to us. From that day on, I was tormented by my grief for Austin every day, but there was actually something else that bothered me more. It was the extreme fear that the devil would come for me, too. So every night I prayed to God to protect me. 7 years passed, and during that time, I have read and reread countless prayers. Sometimes in my dreams, Austin comes to me crying and asks me to kill the devils for him. I've thought about trying to take revenge on the devils, but I know that challenging a devil is like jumping into a volcano. My name is Olivia, and I live in Malaysia. I moved there when I was 14 and was staying at my cousin's house in 2011. My family had no intention of visiting my cousin's house in Langkawi, but my aunt suggested that we do so for 4 weeks. This detail will be very important later in the story. We informed our relative, whom I would call Kay, about our upcoming trip during a quick visit to her home. She became obsessed with the idea of visiting Langkawi because she hadn't seen her family in a long time. So she begged my dad to take her with us on the trip, but he said no because we were going to my cousin's house and wouldn't be staying in a motel. She, of course, said she could handle it, and all she wanted was to see her family again. But my father said no again. To clarify why he said no, let me describe Kay and who she was. Kay was 24, one of my aunt's sisters. She worked as a zoologist and earned enough money to travel to Langkawi, rent a motel room, and visit her family on her own. Because she knew all of this, my father stormed out of her house in rage when she kept asking about the trip. Also, it was Saturday, and we were leaving for the trip that day. A few hours later, while waiting for the ferry, I noticed a woman with long brunette hair looking at me. I thought nothing of it and assumed she was taking the same ferry as us. After 30 minutes of waiting, we were finally able to board the ferry. After my family took our assigned seats, I noticed the same woman I had seen earlier sitting not far away, just 3 seats behind me. Once again, I dismissed it and assumed she was sitting in the seat she had paid for. After 2 hours, we arrived at the dock, disembarked from the ferry, and began walking to the passport scanning area. And guess what? The same woman was following us there. I got chills and the creeps from her, so I told my father what was happening. He then told me that he had noticed it as well, but did not want to tell me because it might scare me. Later, we just waited outside the building for my aunt to arrive and pick us up. After what seemed like 2 hours, she arrived and greeted us. I kept quiet during the car ride because I was still scared of the woman with the long brunette hair. After about 45 minutes, I looked behind us and noticed a taxi. The previously mentioned woman was in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. I was terrified, but I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want them to think I was making everything up. After 2 weeks on the trip, I'd almost forgotten about the woman. It was nighttime, and I was sleeping soundly until I awoke to red and blue lights flashing outside. I got up and asked one of my cousins what had happened. I wish I had known sooner about what I was going to find out. My aunt's sister, Kay, had brunette hair. One of the locals was walking around and noticed Kay trying to break into the house. They did not recognize Kay and were suspicious, so they called the police, which was a good thing. Kay was holding a knife and a gun in her pocket, intending to kill my cousins. Apparently, her reason was that my father told her she couldn't join the trip. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if the residents hadn't called the police. This is a story of something that happened to me when I was in my early 20s. Aaron, my friend at the time, was into a strange religion, which was more of a cult than a religion. I told him not to believe in such things, but he didn't listen to me. He said that all people who believed in that religion were extremely wealthy and asked me if I was curious as to why. Then he said, "Everyone has their own luck, but did you know that you can steal someone else's luck? Bro, what would it be like if you could have money, fame, health, everything? Imagine you could reach the top of this world." I told him that was superstition, but he raised his voice and said, I saw our leader create cracks in other people's souls and drain their luck. It's like taking someone's wallet without anyone knowing. People who lose their luck suddenly find their lives ruined without even knowing why. Our religious leader has amassed so much fortune by stealing so much luck that now his house is so full of wads of money that there's no room to fit it in. I felt that Aaron had fallen into the wrong circles, and I wanted to save him somehow, so I cursed at him and told him to come to his senses. Then he glared at me scarily. His eyes looked like that of a wild animal that had been starving for a long time. He whispered to me, "Watch how my life changes. Be prepared to be surprised. Everyone will envy me." When I saw the look in his eyes, I realized that I could no longer persuade him. As time passed, he became more and more absorbed in the religion, and eventually he stopped seeing his friends. Also, no matter when I called him, he was always reciting a spell. What was really strange was that when I saw him a few months later, his face had turned horrifying. He lost weight and his skin dried out, making him look like a dry tree walking around. Still, he told me everything was going well. He continued to look at people passing by and recited his spell. He followed people who looked particularly rich for a while, staring intently at their faces. When I told him to please stop believing in that religion, he told me, "If I just learn a little more, I'll completely master the art of witchcraft. Then the luck of all the people in front of me will become mine." I was eating at a restaurant with him, and he was reading a religious book even while eating. He said that the magic method of stealing luck is a secret technique that has been passed down to only a very small number of people since ancient times, and that he spent all his money to learn it. I told him it was all a hoax, but he laughed and screamed like a crazy person. "If you don't know anything, keep quiet!" Because I worked hard recently and had been promoted at work, I tried to encourage him that if he lived a good life like me, his life would turn out just fine. He looked surprised when he heard my story, then suddenly grabbed my hand and chanted a spell at incredible speed. His eyes seemed to be on fire, and he held my hand so hard that it felt like it would break. I was startled and shook off his hand. I was annoyed, but at the same time I felt sorry for him and wanted to take him to a psychiatrist. After dinner, I went home. But that night, I experienced something very bizarre. While I was sleeping, I felt someone's presence, and when I opened my eyes, Aaron was in front of me. However, he was not standing, but floating in the air. I thought it was a dream and tried to wake myself up, but my body wouldn't move. He smiled brightly and shouted, "Meeting you like this makes me feel different, bro!" For some reason, an ominous feeling enveloped me. Aaron smiled and recited the spell, and he put his hand on my chest. Then, I suddenly felt intense hopelessness, and the world in front of me became increasingly dark. Then, he closed his eyes. His gaunt face looked happy. I struggled with all my might, finally freed myself from paralysis, and punched him. He screamed and disappeared like smoke. I sat there wondering if this was a dream, but it was too vivid to be. I wondered what on earth this meant. But then, I realized something I didn't want to believe. Aaron had come to steal my luck. This experience happened to me when I was around 7 or 8 years old. My sister has her own room while my little brother and I share a room with a bunk bed, and my little brother sleeps on top. I often go to bed at 3 a.m. after playing and watching movies. So around 3 a.m. in the morning, I go to my room and go to sleep. When the light is off in the room, you can't see anything, but I actually like that because I can sleep better. As I was falling asleep, I felt my brother coming down from the top bunk, but then went back up immediately. I was surprised because he usually uses the bathroom when he climbs down during the night, but I thought maybe he changed his mind about going to the bathroom, so he went back up, so I didn't pay attention. After a while, I heard some scratching noises, like the wall was being scratched. I got annoyed, so I kicked the bottom of the top bunk. He stopped but seemed to hold back his laughter, and I asked, "Why are you laughing?" When I said that, he lowered his head and peered at me. In the darkness, I couldn't see his face, but I could see he was staring at me. I thought he was just trying to scare me, so I just stared back at him. Eventually, my eyes adjusted to the darkness so I could see him little by little. But before I could see his face completely, he moved and lay back down again. The only thing I noticed when my eyes adjusted was that he was laughing. He was smiling with his mouth open because I immediately saw his teeth. At that time, I honestly was frightened and scared because my brother would also be scared, and it was weird for him to do that at 3 a.m. in the morning. I didn't pay attention and just covered my eyes with my arm while trying to sleep. While I was sleeping, someone called out to me. The voice was calling me by my first name. When I heard my name, I was horrified and couldn't breathe because my youngest brother always calls me brother. I didn't answer and I pretended that I was asleep. After that, the whole night it was like someone was scratching at the top of the bunk bed and I could feel the shaking. The scratching was so hard and violent. I don't know what part of his body he was scratching, but I can imagine that his skin was getting torn up because of how intense the sound was. I eventually fell back asleep because I was tired from staying up all night and later woke up around 10 a.m. I looked at the top bunk, but my youngest brother was not there. I immediately went downstairs. I saw that he was getting ready for school, but he was just watching YouTube like nothing had happened. I smacked him on the shoulder and said, "You're so lame for scaring me last night." He got confused and said that he was sleeping in our sister's room. It turns out that that night, my sister didn't come home and slept at her boyfriend's house. After this incident, our room was just used as a storage room and my brother and I slept downstairs. We put a cross on the door of that room, but there are times when the cross tilts to the side, so we put it back in its original position. But it just keeps getting tilted. We consulted a priest and the priest only told us not to let the cross turn upside down completely, or else the entity will follow us for eternity. This is a story about the terrible events that occurred after I moved into a house 8 years ago. The house was far from town, right at the bottom of the mountain. Perhaps that's why it was said that the house had been empty for quite a long time. Although this fact was a bit unpleasant to me, I was swayed by the very low price and signed the contract. However, after I entered the house, 2 police officers came the next day. They spoke to me with serious expressions. "Did you know that many of the people who previously lived in this house are missing? I'm guessing it was probably done by wild animals that came down the mountain behind here. Do you have to live in this house?" I smiled, pointing to my German shepherd in the yard. "Don't worry, that guy is a professional hunter of wild animals." But they didn't laugh at my joke. They walked around the house a few times and then left. A few days later, while I was watching TV, my dog suddenly started barking in the yard. Then he cried out, but there was a loud thud, and after that, I couldn't hear him anymore. I was so shocked that I ran into the front yard, but I couldn't see my dog. His leash was broken, and there was a lot of loose dirt all over the yard. And there was a deep hole in the ground in one part of the yard. It felt like my dog might have fallen into that hole. But I was so confused because there was no such hole in the yard until the day before. I walked up close to the hole and looked inside with a flashlight, but it was so deep that I couldn't see the bottom. There was debris flying around in the air as if something had just fallen into a hole. I was in shock and was wondering what to do once I got inside when I heard my dog whining outside again. But this time, the sound seemed to be very far away. I ran out into the yard again, but there was nothing in sight. I kept an eye on the hole in the front yard every day from that day on, and sometimes I heard faint vibrations coming from the ground, but I couldn't tell if it was real or my imagination. Then a few days later, I got a call from my friend Jack. He said he would come visit and see my new house. I told him to come on a different day, but he said he was already on his way. A few hours later, he arrived and I heard his voice calling me from outside the front door. I went to the front door and opened the door, but Jack wasn't there. I was flustered because I definitely heard Jack's voice. Was I hallucinating? I looked at my phone. There was a message from Jack. "What is this hole in your yard? There's something moving in the hole." It was a message from 5 minutes ago. I walked to the front yard and I was shocked. The hole in the front yard was bigger than before, and there were human footprints around the hole, and they seemed to be Jack's footprints. I got closer and saw the hole. The hole was big enough for a person to fall into. I looked down into the hole, but it was so deep that all I could see was darkness. I screamed into the hole,
Jack! Are you down there?
but there was nothing. I slammed my fist into the ground, wondering if I was dreaming. My fist throbbed with pain. I got my phone out and called Jack. At first, I thought his phone was ringing from deep inside the hole, but after a moment, it felt like maybe it was just a sound created by my imagination. He didn't answer the phone. I reported what happened to the police. The police said they could not search inside the hole because it was too deep. The next day, Jack still could not be contacted and his family reported him missing. I finally decided that I had to look inside the hole myself, so I attached a small light to a GoPro camera, tied a string to it, and lowered the camera into the hole. After lowering it for a while, I felt the camera hit the bottom, and so I started lifting it back out. Once I had it out, I tried playing back the video. The hole was extremely deep, and there were countless holes going in various directions within it. I could hear the sound of something moving inside the hole, but I couldn't see anything moving in the video. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a sound coming from the yard, as if a car was moving and its tires were scraping against the ground. But it was a more bizarre sound than that. I went to the front door and looked out the window, and then I saw something shocking. Something large and purple had slipped into a hole in the front yard. It looked like a snake, but it was huge. It also had an incredibly large head. Of course, I had just woken up, and since I saw it only for a split second, it could have been an illusion. I wanted to go out to the hole and take a closer look, but I was so scared that I couldn't muster the courage to do it. I contacted the police again, but they just said I was overly stressed and should get some rest. This whole situation was scary and made me feel crazy, so I decided that I would have to move somewhere else and eventually started packing. But a few days later, I was shocked to find that the hole in the yard was filled with dirt. But I hadn't hired anyone to fill the hole with dirt, and there was no dirt nearby to use. I continued to feel panicked and swiftly moved out. A few months later, I got a call from someone who wanted to buy the house. I explained to him what had happened and told him that it was a very dangerous house. But he laughed and said if such a large mole appeared, he would catch it and eat it himself. I kept trying to convince him that it wasn't a mole, but he wouldn't listen to me. So I sold it to him and he moved into the house. About a month later, he disappeared. According to the police, before he went missing, he called 911 and shouted,
What the hell is this? Is there an animal like this in the world? Almost 20 feet long. It's so fast. It came right up in front of me. Ah!
The police arrived 20 minutes later, but the only thing they found was a large hole in the yard. The man was nowhere to be found. What on earth is going on in that yard? Hello, Wansee. My name is Obayed. I've been watching your videos for the past few days, and I want to share my story. This story is from when I was 14 or 15. The year was 2016 or 17. My brothers and I were all in our teens, and we were attending a birthday party for one of my mom's colleagues at an Asian restaurant located in a quiet area of the city that they're familiar with. It was probably 11 p.m., and we were getting ready to head back home, but my brother wanted to buy some candy in a small convenience store nearby, and my mom agreed since it was just in front of the restaurant. I went with him to shop while everyone else waited. As we walked in, my brother asked me to look at the candy and said he'd go look for some ice cream. So I went and checked if the candies were worth getting. He was gone for a minute, but then suddenly he ran up to me and whispered to me in a hurried and scared voice, "Drop everything, we need to leave." I was so confused and I didn't get what he meant, so he told me that he saw a dead woman's legs being dragged on the floor through the back door. For some dumb reason, I went to go look, but the door at the back of the shop was already shut, so I just turned around and ran back to the restaurant with my brother. I asked my brother to tell me exactly what he saw, and he said he would tell me on the way home. We finally went to the car, and my brother explained everything to me. He said that while he was looking at the ice cream, he heard the sound of something metal hit the floor, and then he saw two men dragging a human body through a door. He said the body was definitely a woman's. My brother tried convincing my mom, but she didn't believe him. But I know he wasn't lying or trying to pull a prank because, knowing my brother, he wouldn't abandon candy and ice cream for no reason, and he's not the type to pull pranks. To this day, I still can't stop wondering what would have happened if we got caught. Hey, my name is Justin. I'm a big fan, by the way, and I watch all of your videos. I'm not sure if this is the way to contact you guys about this, but I have a scary story that happened when I was around 12 years old. I slept in the basement of my home at the time. To give the layout, you'd come down the stairs and turn right for the bathroom, turn left for the storage room and furnace room, and straight ahead was my room and the living room. One night, I was getting ready for bed after finishing some homework. This was around 1 to 2 a.m. I have severe insomnia, so I've always struggled to sleep, and this turned me into sort of a night owl. I genuinely enjoy the dark hours, spending nights gaming or reading. Anyway, as I was getting ready for bed, I felt an odd sensation. It was almost as if a ghostly chill passed through me, making me shiver. I shrugged it off and continued getting ready for bed. Once I was done and got into bed, I watched some videos on YouTube for a bit and then read my book. After about an hour of reading, I saw it was 3 a.m. and I finally felt tired, so I turned out the lights and closed my eyes. As I was beginning to drift off, I heard the shower door open. I had one of those standing showers designed in a quarter circle shape with a sliding door. It sounded like someone had opened the sliding door, so I propped my head up to listen. After about a minute of silence, I figured it was my imagination, so I lied back down. Suddenly, the shower door slammed closed so hard that I jumped up to the edge of the bed. My heart was racing. Right after that, I could hear some papers in the living room rustling around. I was far too scared to go check in the darkness, so I sat there, frozen in silence. A few minutes went by and I managed to relax myself a bit. I turned my head in the direction of my open closet, and for a split second, I saw a ghostly face of a woman there. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. The face was terrifying. It had dark hair and wide, bloodshot eyes. It also looked as if it had something like a piece of cloth wrapped around its mouth. There was nothing below its chin that appeared for that second, only its head and face. I passed out from terror and woke up in the morning lying on the edge of my bed. I got up to find my homework papers had been tossed all over the living room, and when I checked the shower, it had a crack in the plastic, likely from it being slammed closed. Until now, I hadn't told anyone, as I knew no one would believe me anyway. Hi, I'm Jody from Bangladesh. This is a story from 35 years ago. It happened to my grandfather. One night, my grandfather was returning home after buying 2 Hilsa fish. Grandfather had to cross a bridge on his way back home, and as he was crossing the bridge, he heard a relative of his call out to him. The person who called out to my grandfather did not usually talk to him at all, so he was a little bit shocked. Then the man started to come forward on the bridge, and at one point, that man put his arm on my grandfather's shoulder and started saying something. When the man put his arm on my grandfather's shoulder, grandfather could smell a very rotten stench coming from him. My grandfather also noticed that he couldn't feel any weight from the man's arm. They were standing along the middle of the bridge when grandfather noticed that the man's legs were even missing, and he was floating in the air with his arm on my grandfather's shoulders. Then grandfather realized that this man was a ghost in the guise of his relative. At that moment, the ghost started laughing and looked at the fish in grandfather's hand and said,
Give me the fish. I will eat them.
That's when grandfather started reciting prayers, and the ghost started screaming and said,
If I see you another day, I will kill you before you can recite any prayers.
It was a famous ghost in our country whose name is Mekobut. It was said that if the ghost saw someone with fish at night, he would scare them and take their fish. If the person did not let Mekobut eat the fish, the ghost would even kill them. This happened back in high school during the winter. I was walking back home from school listening to some music. Ahead of me, I noticed a black cat was just standing in the middle of the walkway. It had the prettiest blue eyes. I stopped for a moment to look at it. I hadn't seen it before, and it didn't have a collar but looked a little too clean to be a stray. I also noticed that the cat had a white spot around its left eye. It was strange that the cat was just outside all by itself. It was snowing heavily, and stray cats in my area would usually hide in local abandoned buildings for warmth. I felt bad for the poor thing, but I knew I couldn't take it home. I eventually started walking away when I heard the cat meowing. It was very loud and almost aggressive. I felt a little unsettled and started walking faster. I figured it was just very hungry and decided that if I saw it the next day, I'd give it some food. I kept walking home, and at a certain point, I was struck with a very uneasy feeling. I took out my earbuds and looked around. That's when I saw a man. He was very tall and skinny, had shaggy hair, and was wearing a black trench coat. I couldn't make out any of his facial features because of the heavy snow. He was just standing there in the middle of the road. Something felt very off, but I continued walking, this time without music, just to be more wary of my surroundings. That's when I heard heavy footsteps, like someone was quickly approaching me. I turned around and saw the man sprinting towards me. I felt horrified and started running away since the guy was a lot taller and probably more athletic than out-of-shape high school me. He caught up to me quickly. I felt my heart beating in my throat. I was horrified that he might get to me at any moment, and who knows what he'd do then. My fears came true when I felt a hand grab me by my shoulder. I tried to shake it off, but the grip was way too strong. When I looked back at him, the first thing I noticed was his eyes. They were a very deep shade of blue. I also saw that he had a white spot around his left eye that looked like it could be from vitiligo. It was exactly like that cat that I had seen earlier. He didn't look homeless. He actually had a very clean face. His expression was just blank. He didn't look angry, happy, sad, nothing. Just empty blue eyes staring at me. He didn't take out a knife or attack me in any way, just held my arm really tight. I don't know how, but I managed to gain the strength to escape his grasp and run away. I eventually managed to get home. Homeless people and drug addicts walking around the street wasn't an uncommon occurrence where I lived. For some reason, that man was just different. I don't believe in things like mythical creatures, but the similarities were just too uncanny. I don't know if it was a shapeshifter, a skinwalker, or whatever else, but to this day, I firmly believe that what I saw that day wasn't a normal human.
I was a really brave kid. I was not scared of the dark, monsters, or ghosts. In fact, I even really liked listening to scary stories as a kid. I was around the age of 4 or 5 when this incident took place. We are a family of 4. Me, my mom, my dad, and my brother. And we live in an apartment. My brother and I used to share a room as kids, and our room had a balcony where my mom hung out clothes to dry. One night, my mother had gone to take a shower, and my dad and my brother had gone out somewhere. I was just relaxing on the couch when I heard my mom come out of the bathroom. She went to my room so she could take some dried clothes from the balcony to wear. I was right beside her, riding my tricycle on the balcony. Since we lived on the second floor, there was no way anyone can enter the balcony. My mom left the room, and I was still there on the balcony riding my tricycle. Minutes passed, and I became bored, so I decided to leave my tricycle. Right as I was about to step off of the tricycle, something grabbed my hand, something large. It was all gray and faceless. It looked like a silhouette of a person wearing an oversized hoodie. It just stood there holding my hand. I was shocked. I did not say a word. All I did was try to escape it. I tried to pull myself away from it, but it was not letting go. After a few minutes of struggling, it let go and disappeared. Poof, gone. I don't remember what happened after that. I'm 15 now and still live in the same house. No one believes me when I tell them this story. Everyone says it was just a dream, but I don't believe them. I know I felt its hand on me. Two years ago, I lived on a crescent road. My suburb was honestly fairly sketchy, and there was crime happening every now and then. Like someone a few houses away from me had been murdered by his brother, but I won't go into that, considering I don't know much of what happened. Anyway, I'd never been that fearful of where I lived, despite all of the things happening. My road was very quiet all the time. You wouldn't really see people out, and the houses were very close to one another, enough so that you can hear any yelling from the neighbors. My room had a window that directly peered into the backyard, and there was a gate at the end of the pathway. but our backyard gate didn't have a lock on it, as it had been broken, and we laid bricks along the gap under the gate, as we had a rabbit that could escape through it. Anyway, I usually fall asleep after 11:30 p.m. at the earliest, but on this particular night, 2 days before my birthday, I happened to drift off around 10. My mom slept with me at the time, as we didn't have many rooms. Not too long into our sleep, we were both awakened by a noise. My mom had been significantly more alert than me and asked me, "Did you hear that?" I agreed, but said that it was most likely a cat because our street was infested with them, and they'd always make noise at night, so I went back to sleep. A few minutes later, I woke up to loud screaming from my mom and her ushering me to leave the room as she yelled "robber" so that my dad would wake up, as he slept in the room farthest away from us. Then, my mom explained what had happened. She said that after I had gone to sleep, she got up on her elbows to look out the window as she thought she could hear footsteps. Then, to her horror, there was a man walking into the backyard who hadn't noticed her yet. But since our lamp was on, he looked into the window and saw my mom. My mom froze as he looked at her, and he froze too, as if he hadn't expected to see anyone. While watching him, my mom went to tap me to wake me up, and as she did that, he gestured to her to not say anything, and that is what got her to scream. My dad didn't initially believe her until he saw the backyard gate was open, meaning that the sound that had woken us up was the scraping of the bricks on the concrete. We called the police, and they didn't find anything, and from that night on, we always closed the shutter blinds. The scariest part was that the man could have easily gotten into my room, as the window was massive and there was only a flimsy net between the inside and the outside. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't seen him and screamed.
This is a terrible story that happened to me while working as a dog sitter. One day, I found a person on the internet who said he would pay a lot of money for a dog sitter, and since his house was not far away, I decided to take care of his dog for 3 days. When I arrived in front of his house, there was a "Beware of Dogs" sign on the door, and the smell of rotting food was in the air. I knocked on the door and heard a man's voice from inside. He said, "The door is open, come in." And then I heard a barking sound. The barking sounded like that of a vicious dog. I got a little anxious. When I opened the door and went in, I couldn't see anyone in the house. I said, "Are you there?" And I could hear the dog panting in the living room. The sound came closer and closer. While I was looking around for the owner, the dog appeared out of nowhere and I yelled out in surprise. The only thing is, it wasn't a dog. It was a person. A person crawling on all fours and approaching me like they're a pet. He appeared to be a man in his 30s. There was a dog collar around his neck. He was also wearing fur-like fabric that covered his entire body and had an artificial tail attached to his buttocks. He said to me, "You're the one who will take care of me for the next 3 days? Nice to meet you." He shook his butt wildly and his tail wagged. Then he continued walking on all fours, now toward the kitchen, and said, "The food is in here. These are meats that are hard to find." He opened the refrigerator door by moving his hand like a dog moving its paw. Inside it was a pile of large, deep red chunks of meat. For some reason, I got goosebumps and took a step back. He then ran up to me, slammed his head into my leg, and screamed, "Are you going to keep standing there blankly like that? Pat my head! Pat my head!" I was so confused and horrified that I screamed out. Then he started licking my hand. A few seconds later, a terrible stench hit my nose and I immediately felt dizzy and nauseous. I pushed him away and started running to the door when he started barking. His bark was startlingly dog-like. I kicked open the front door and started running. While running, I made the mistake of looking back. He was chasing after me on all fours at incredible speed. I was so shocked that I felt like I was going to faint. I screamed out like crazy for help. "Help! There's a crazy dog here!" People stuck their heads out of their windows to look and see what was happening. And when they saw the man running towards me, their eyes widened. Before I knew it, the crazy dog man was in front of me, and he started panting and lifting his lips to bare his teeth. I could see his dark gums and yellow, large teeth. He growled and lunged at me, my legs shaking like crazy. At that moment, a man came running with a baseball bat and yelled at the crazy dog guy to go away. The crazy guy saw him and started barking wildly. The crazy dog guy went after the man and bit his leg, and he panicked and hit the crazy dog guy on the head with a bat. Thankfully, that made him run away, making a noise similar to a dog's whining. The whole scene was unbelievable, and I was so shaken up that I could barely catch my breath. The man had teeth marks and some blood on his leg, but he said it was not a serious injury and went into his house to bandage it. I thanked him countless times, and he said to me, "This is not the first incident like this. In the past, a young man went to that house to work as a pet sitter and was bitten by that crazy guy, leaving him with 30 stitches on his leg. And that crazy guy has been to jail once before. Once that crazy guy bites you, he won't let you go unless you hit him on the head. Remember, you should really hit him on the head with all your might." After that, I never worked as a dog sitter again. I sometimes wonder, who was that crazy guy and what is he doing now?
My name is Humaira. I'm 21 years old. I'm a big fan of your YouTube channel. I am from Bangladesh and I live in the Mymensingh district. I want to share a horror story that happened to me. This story is from when I was 10 years old and I lived in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. At the time, I lived in an apartment with my parents and my 2 brothers. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, and a balcony. The apartment was a bit small for my family's size, but due to some financial issues, we had to manage. One day, my uncle, who is my mom's brother, came to our house to visit us. He came in the afternoon and spent some time with us. We chatted and watched TV, but it was night, and at around 8 p.m., I started feeling sleepy. I had to get up at 6:30 a.m. for school. I was kind of lazy, and I would always go to sleep at 8 p.m. So, like normal, I was just watching TV and starting to drift off to sleep. Right as I fell asleep, I heard my mom telling my uncle to stay at our house for the night. I don't remember the time exactly, but it was around midnight when I woke up. I had fallen asleep in my parents' room, but my mom didn't wake me up and just let me sleep in this room, and she was sleeping next to me. My dad must have been sleeping with my brothers in the other room. I was trying to fall back asleep, but I couldn't and didn't know why. I looked around, and since the door was open, from down the hallway, I could see a tall shadow figure. There was a long corridor between the room I was in and where it was standing, and the shadow figure was peeking around the corner like it was playing with me. I was scared to death, but I didn't want to wake up my mom. Since he was supposed to be staying over, I thought it must just be my uncle. It didn't really make sense that he would be up at midnight staring down the hallway, but I just figured it was him since that made the most sense. Once I decided it was him, I wasn't afraid anymore and eventually fell back asleep, though the figure never stopped staring down the hall. I still don't understand why I thought that figure was my uncle, but as it turns out, when I woke up that morning, I learned that my uncle had actually not stayed the night. I was scared out of my mind. To this day, I still don't know what it was that was looking at me from down the hallway that night.
My name is Kimberly, and I'm 19 years old. I have light brown skin, brown eyes, and shoulder-length black hair. I want to share my personal scary story that happened to me 2 years ago. It was a Friday, and I had just come home from school. I greeted my mom as she was leaving for work, and she told me to not wait up for her since she would be coming home late. My dad left us when I was a baby, and since then, it's only been my mom and I. I told her okay, and she left. I went upstairs and changed into my comfy clothes and went back downstairs into the kitchen, where I started cooking dinner for me and her to eat when she came home from work. After cooking, I did a little bit of chores, took a shower, ate dinner, and checked all the doors and windows to make sure that they were locked. When I was finished cleaning up, I went into the living room with my computer, as I wanted to catch up on some of the shows that I had missed recently. About 3 hours into watching my show, I heard our main door being open and closed. I thought it was my mom, so I didn't pay attention and went back to watching my show. I had headphones in, so I couldn't hear my mom talking to me. Normally, she would have to come over to me, and that's when I felt someone was leaning over the couch I was sitting on. As I slowly lifted my head, I saw my mom looking down at me with her eyes open unnaturally wide and staring at me immensely. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't respond, and as I kept looking at her, I felt like something was off about her. I couldn't tell exactly, but I just felt off about her. As I looked closely, I saw she wasn't wearing her nurse scrubs. I figured she probably went upstairs and changed before I could see her. After about 30 seconds of her staring at me, she slowly looked up at the ceiling and back at me, then kissed me on the forehead. Her lips were so cold, it felt like she had put ice on her lips and left it on until they were frozen. Then she walked into the kitchen, and I couldn't see her from where I was sitting. I didn't think anything about it and went back to watching my show. Then the realization hit me. I remembered she told me that she would be coming home late and not to wait up. I also remembered that she isn't a person who would come up to me like that and kiss me on the forehead. She had never done it since I was a baby, as long as I could remember. I was frozen for a minute, then I slowly picked up my phone and called her, hoping I would hear it ringing in the house somewhere. She picked up and asked me what was wrong. I asked her if she was home, but she said no and asked me if I was alright. I told her someone was in the house. I didn't tell her I saw her or something pretending to be her, but she told me to run to our next door neighbor while she called the police. She hung up to call them, and I got up and ran. When I was at the main door to go outside, I looked back into the hallway. It was her, in the dark. She was just standing there. I ran to our neighbor and knocked loudly. She opened up and let me in. I told her someone was in our house. After about 5 minutes of waiting for the police, I heard them coming. I was outside with my neighbor while we watched the cops entering my house. About 10 minutes later, a cop came up to me saying they didn't find anything or any trace of anyone trying to enter the house. I waited at my neighbor's house until late when my mom came home. It's been 2 years since this traumatizing event happened to me. We moved out of there a year ago, and I never told anyone, not even my mom, that I saw her doppelganger.
I'm Bailey. This story happened when I was in the 7th grade. For reference, I was a very petite girl with long, dirty blonde hair, braces, and glasses. Anyway, it all started in the middle school of my 7th grade year. In my science class, my friends and I were given assigned seats for a project that would be going on for about half a semester. I was paired at a table with 2 friends and a random boy. Let's call my friends Hannah and Allie. The boy, let's call him Liam, gave me bad vibes right off the bat. He had stringy, greasy hair, always wore one of the same 2 sweatshirts, and always gave me blank-faced, hostile glances. We all started talking, and I found out pretty quickly how mean Liam was. He would insult anything and everything about all 3 of us. As middle school girls, we would shoot right back at him, although he never seemed offended at all, just amused. Time passed, and Liam got stranger and stranger. He would constantly hit me and my friends, and poke us with pencils so violently I would consider it stabbing. For some reason, we never thought of it as weird, seeing as everyone at my school was very physically aggressive, including us because we would constantly hit each other playfully. But he always seemed to target me the most. I sat next to him in my social studies class too, and he would always call us best friends, with a big grin on his face. It always rubbed me the wrong way. Hannah and Allie would always laugh about his craziness, but Liam actually terrified me. It went downhill even more when he wrote "Kill Bailey in school" in a black notebook. Both Hannah and Allie saw it, and it became a big joke that he put me on a 1-person hit list. Even though it scared the crap out of me, I acted like it was funny since Liam seemed so nonchalant about it. What scared me even more was that I'm almost positive I saw a section right next to my name titled Plan. After that, he would always tell me how he was going to find my address and show up at my house in the middle of the night. He would tell me about the guns he has at his house, and as usual, my friends just laughed it off. I don't know why I didn't tell anyone else. I guess I didn't want to get mocked by everyone if it was all just a harmless joke. But one day, something happened that I will never forget. We were working on the project I mentioned previously, which was a paper roller coaster, and Liam asked if he could go get a drink of water. After he left, I felt that I needed to go to the bathroom. I didn't want to at first because the water fountain was in between the boys' and girls' bathroom, which meant Liam would be right there. But I couldn't hold it in any longer and asked to leave. As I walked down the hallway, I saw Liam standing at the water fountain, talking with another boy. He watched me rush down the hallway, never breaking eye contact. When I was in the bathroom, I had a sinking feeling the whole time I was there, like something in the back of my mind telling me to hurry up. So I complied with my instincts. When I threw open the restroom door, Liam was still there with the boy. I practically ran down the hallway to my class. I could feel his eyes on me as I waited for the classroom door to open. About a minute later, he walked into class and came straight to our table and leaned down next to me. And what he said will always chill me to the bone. "You're lucky you left when you did." I just froze. I was in the bathroom alone, and Liam and that boy were the only 2 in the hallway. Was Liam planning on doing something when I was alone, but the boy messed it up? I won't ever know, because nothing like that happened again. He was still physically violent towards me, and when I mentioned the situation to my friends, they didn't take it seriously and joked about it, so I never brought it up again. The next year in 8th grade, Liam disappeared from school and never came back. It was like he never existed. None of his friends ever mentioned him or where he went. The only time his name is brought up is when we make jokes about him, like, "Oh, that loud thunk outside must be Liam coming back," or "I bet that yell in the hallway was Liam." He became an inside joke for anything creepy or bizarre that happened. Honestly, I don't know if I was just paranoid and he was just a stupid boy trying to mess with me, but I genuinely think that he wanted me dead. So let's hope I never meet Liam again.
One night while I was sleeping, I woke up in a panic to my brother Alex screaming. I ran into his room and found him lying in his bed, thrashing back and forth. He shouted,
"Don't go, Noah! Don't go! You should never approach that man. Never, never."
I shook him forcefully, and he finally woke up. I asked him what was wrong, and with tears streaming down his face, he told me why he was having nightmares. About a month ago, Alex was playing at his friend Noah's house when he heard a strange noise outside. They looked outside and saw a man standing in the front yard, so Noah went outside to talk to him. But the face of the man standing in the yard was purple, and when Alex saw his face, he felt his stomach turn. Alex had a gut feeling that something was ominous, and he yelled at Noah, telling him not to go. But Noah had already approached the man. After Noah had looked at the man's face for a few seconds, he froze and then fell and hit the ground like a tree. Alex was shocked and shouted,
"What happened?"
Noah collapsed on the ground, convulsing and gasping for air. The purple-faced man laughed wildly, put his face right up to Noah's, and taunted him. As Alex watched the man from behind the window, he felt an extremely bizarre emotion and fear welling up in his chest. He called out to Noah, but he continued to lie on the ground, clearly in pain. He realized nothing was working and called 911. However, by the time the police and rescue teams arrived, Noah had already stopped breathing, and the purple-faced man had vanished. Later, doctors performed an autopsy on Noah's body, and they found that the cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. However, his body was uninjured, without any cuts or bruises, and no harmful substances were found in his body. The doctor said something had damaged Noah's heart, but the cause of damage was unknown. The doctor was perplexed, saying it was his first time seeing a case like this. Alex was speechless. He knew he saw Noah rolling around in pain before he died, but Noah was seemingly healthy, and he was playing normally with Alex until just seconds before he met the purple-faced man. When the purple-faced man looked down at Noah's face, Noah suddenly collapsed. Alex told this to the police, but they didn't listen to him. From that day on, Alex suffered from tremendous fear and guilt. But sometime later, he heard even more shocking news. Within 3 days of the original incident, 3 more people had suffered heart attacks in our neighborhood. Among them, 2 died and 1 survived. Shockingly, they all were reportedly seen near a purple-faced man before collapsing. One of the men who survived said this,
"The moment I saw that man's face, I felt my heart tightening like crazy. I don't know why. That man's eyes were full of hate, cold as ice, and that smile that smelled of blood. As soon as I saw that face, I couldn't breathe. My whole body felt weak, but I intuitively knew that I could survive if I got as far away from that man as possible. So I crawled away with all my might. But the man came after me and put his face right up to my nose and laughed. He told me to look at his face, and I squeezed my eyes shut. Not seeing his face made the pain a little better. But this time, his laughter. The moment he started laughing maniacally in my ear, my heart tightened again. I closed my eyes, covered my ears with my hands, and crawled like crazy. Then my neighbors found me and the man ran off. I think I came back from the dead. I really didn't know that just by looking at someone, you could die."
The police did not believe him. From that day on, the purple-faced man never appeared in our neighborhood again. Who was he, and why did people die? This incident remains a mystery to this day.
The story I am telling you now is something that happened to me 7 years ago when I was in college. At that time, I had a best friend named Charles. Charles dreamed of being an exorcist and always said that he wanted to exorcise evil spirits with his own hands. Since he wanted to practice, he would often use a Ouija board to summon evil spirits. One day, he told me that he needed help exorcising evil spirits and asked me to use the Ouija board with him. Since I didn't believe in such things, I just went to Charles' house without thinking much about it. I couldn't have imagined the consequences that choice would bring. At midnight, we lit candles and started using the Ouija board. But that's when the event I will never forget occurred. Charles called out,
"Devil! Evil spirit! Come here!"
Then Charles asked if anyone was present in the room, and the pointer moved to yes. When Charles asked, "What is your name?" the pointer moved to Moloch. Charles muttered to himself,
"Okay, Moloch, show us your physical form. What do you look like?"
After this, the pointer didn't move, and the room was still and silent. Then Charles shouted,
"Show us your terrifying face!"
But at that moment, suddenly a pair of eyes appeared on Charles' forehead. I screamed in surprise. I thought I was hallucinating. Charles looked over at me, not knowing what was going on, and the eyes on his forehead, which looked like snake eyes, moved around very strangely. When I pointed to Charles' forehead and shouted, "Your forehead!" Charles touched his forehead and screamed.
"Ah! What is this?"
Then a small mouth appeared on his forehead, and the mouth spoke in a strange voice.
Look in the mirror, Charles.
And then deep red blood flowed out of the mouth and covered Charles' face. Charles ran into the hallway, howling, and I followed him. Charles screamed and went into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and a moment later came out of the bathroom soaking wet. Some of the blood remained smeared on his face, giving him a faint red glow. Charles stood there with a blank expression. The eyes and mouth were gone from his forehead. Charles and I couldn't say anything. What the hell happened? Charles' body was shaking. Then Charles ran back into the room and shouted,
"I know how to exorcise! I'll send these evil spirits to heaven!"
Charles picked up a book and opened it. The title of the book seemed to be about exorcism. But at that moment, I saw it. Something crawled out from the corners of the dark room. They were people the size of small dwarves. Their bodies were black, with red bumps sticking out of their backs and long tails. They were crawling on all fours toward Charles. I thought I was hallucinating once again, but Charles was seeing them too. I saw his fearful expression and the tears in his eyes. The black dwarves crawled towards Charles and began to gnaw at his legs. Blood flowed from his legs as he screamed in pain. I shouted to Charles in a trembling voice, asking what to do, and he managed to look at the book he was holding and began to recite a spell. However, he could not read properly because of the pain and just continued to scream. Then I saw numerous black blisters forming on Charles' legs, and I saw black liquid bursting out of them. The dwarves were crawling up Charles' body, gnawing at every part of him. Charles's eyes rolled back, and he screamed so much that he lost consciousness. I thought that his parents would come to the room because Charles was screaming so loudly, but for some reason, no one came to the room. After about 5 minutes, Charles' whole body was covered with thousands of black blisters, and black liquid covered his body. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I didn't know what to do. Eventually, the black dwarves crawled back into the corner and disappeared. I stood there blankly, unable to do anything. Tears flowed from my eyes like crazy, and when I looked at the clock, it was 3 a.m. I called the police, and the police and Charles's parents were shocked when they saw Charles' body. They rushed Charles to the hospital. They asked me what the hell had happened, but no matter how much I told them, they never believed me. It was natural that they couldn't believe it. If it were me, I wouldn't have believed it either. Charles received emergency surgery and fortunately did not die, but it took 3 months for his body to recover to its original state. The doctor said she had no idea what caused Charles's body to suddenly become blistered like that. Ever since that night, Charles has not used the Ouija board again, and he's also given up on his dreams of becoming an exorcist. He's become a very quiet person. He does not socialize and mostly just stays in his room. Time has passed, and I do not keep in touch with Charles anymore, but sometimes I wonder how he's doing now. This story is about something I experienced about 20 years ago when I was in my early 20s. At that time, I had broken up with my girlfriend and was going through such miserable days. I wanted to focus on something new to forget her. I decided to go hiking, and while looking at the map, I decided to pick a mountain to go to. Among them, I found a mountain whose name was unfamiliar to me, and I chose to go to that one. Once I arrived, I started up the mountain path, and it seemed like a normal place. As I was climbing the mountain though, the path ended at some point. However, I was still feeling upset and reluctant to go home, so I continued up the mountain and into the forest. Then, at some point, I heard the sound of something moving up ahead of me. I was startled and stopped, thinking it was a wild animal. It sounded like an animal aggressively eating something. I lowered my body to the ground and slowly looked in the direction the sound was coming from, and there was something moving there. When I saw it, I almost fainted. It was covered in red fur, and I couldn't recognize its face. I could only make out its huge nose and mouth, each tooth almost as big as my thumb, and it was eating something. The sound of it chewing down to the bone echoed through the mountains. Its large hands tore the flesh of the lying beast, as if it were tearing paper. The creature's hands were similar to human hands, but its fingers were long and thick, about 3 times as long as a human's. What it was eating was the carcass of a huge animal, like a bear. I felt like vomiting, but I held it back with all my might, thinking that if I threw up right there, it would catch me. I turned around quietly, but the sound of the trees and bushes moving made it look in my direction. It quickly took off a huge chunk of meat that must have weighed about 10 pounds in a single bite, and then started to run towards me. When it raised its body, it seemed to be at least 8 feet tall, and the sight of its enormous body and appearance took my breath away. Its eyes were bright yellow, and its pupils were so small that they were almost invisible. It ran on 2 legs just like a person. It ran toward me with its mouth full of meat and at an incredibly fast speed. I thought, I'm going to die right here. I didn't even scream. My legs felt weak, but I ran with all my might. Behind me, I could hear its heavy breathing and footsteps very clearly. I even felt as if the air it was exhaling was touching my back, but I couldn't tell if it was an illusion or real. I ran so fast that my feet felt like they were burning, and after a while, I didn't hear any more sounds from behind me, so I looked back and saw that it had stopped and was looking somewhere else. I saw something like a deer running in the distance, and then it ran toward the deer. I thought this was my chance to get away, so I ran as fast as I could down the mountain. I heard a deer crying out, and then the sound of bones breaking behind me, but I kept running without looking back. It seemed like I must have descended the mountain in just 30 minutes, even though it took me 3 hours to climb to where I was. I think that because of the extreme situation, I was able to push my body beyond its normal limits. When I got back to the base of the mountain, my leg muscles were so sore that I couldn't even press the accelerator in the car. I barely managed to find the local police station, and I had told them about the strange creature in the mountain, but the police didn't believe me. They said that people are often eaten by wild animals on the mountain. They said that all the bones and flesh would be gone by the time they found the remains, and only skulls were ever found. They said there must be some terrible beast that lives up on the mountain. I pleaded and told them that it wasn't a normal animal, but they simply wouldn't believe me. The thing I saw, it moved its hands like a person, ripped the meat, and ran on 2 feet. It wasn't an animal or a human. it was something else. I went home and Googled it to see if anyone else had reported anything about it, but I couldn't find any information about any creature similar. To this day, I still don't know what that creature was or how I managed to get away from it alive.
Hey, you're my favorite horror story channel, and I have a story for you. A true story, and it just recently happened to me. I had a pretty rough upbringing, to put it lightly. My mother was negligent, and my father was absent. However, I have an aunt who I am very close to, and I feel like she's more like my mother than my actual mother. After I graduated, I moved in with my aunt, as she had kindly offered me a place to stay. It worked out well, because the place I ended up working at was only 5 minutes away from where she lived, so I couldn't pass up the opportunity. She lives in a really nice area. It's a bit of an elderly community, I'll admit it, but it's well kept and the people there are kind. Her place isn't huge, but it isn't tiny either. It's got an upstairs and a downstairs, but it's only got 2 bedrooms, and it's a condominium. My bedroom is very small, but it's the perfect size for me because I'm quite a minimalist. However, my room is right next to the window to the outside, and that's where the story truly begins. At first, I didn't really notice anything odd. Occasionally, I would hear scratching noises against the window or whistling, but I thought it was likely just trees, since there are some near the window. I figured it could also be just normal noises from the house or from outside that I wasn't used to yet. For a while, I didn't even pay too much attention to all the noises. After all, I worked the overnight shift, so by the time I got back and went to bed, it was morning, so I'd go to sleep with the birds chirping. But on my days off, or on the days I wanted to get a little more sleep before work, I'd hear all that constant whistling and scratching against the window. I tried not to be paranoid about it, but things only escalated from there. I have a few plants by my window, so it's a little difficult to see past them. One night, the scratching began again, and I suppose curiosity got the better of me, and I just had to see what it was. I walked over to the window and looked outside, curious about what I'd see. It was so dark I couldn't see much at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the faint outline of a person. They were just standing there, whistling. I thought it was odd, really odd. I mean, it was maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. Most people would be asleep, yet this person was outside, whistling. That didn't explain the scratching though, until I noticed the person going up to everyone's windows, scratching against them with their fingernails, and even tapping the windows sometimes. I assumed to try and get people's attention. Most people would probably freak the hell out at that point, but for some reason, I wasn't really scared, honestly. I mean, sure, this creepy person is trying to be creepy, but I was safe where I was inside. Even so, I pulled out my phone to call the police while keeping an eye on that person to explain what they looked like to the police. It was probably the light from my phone that alerted the person, who I now noticed was a man, but he turned towards me and began sprinting over to my window. I kept my composure, still trying to explain the situation to the police, but the look on the man's face was something I can only describe as deranged. As he began banging on my window, I simply watched. He kept attempting to break it or at least scare me by repeatedly hitting the window over and over again. I rolled my eyes and told the police officer that he was banging on my window now, and they told me that help would be there soon. Around this time, I began mentally thinking about how long this had been happening, for months at least. It didn't happen immediately after I arrived, but I'd been living there for about 7 months at that point, and this man was seemingly doing all this for at least 4 or 5 months, maybe even longer. I don't know how nobody here didn't notice or didn't call the police before I had, or maybe they did, I don't know. The man was still banging against the window, but I had been spacing out and thinking and hadn't looked back at him. I turned around again when I noticed he had a gun in his hand, which he was now slamming against my window. I thought maybe it wasn't loaded, maybe it was just for show, or maybe that was just what I was trying to tell myself since I was now afraid. The officer on the line must have heard me gasp, because they asked me what I saw, and I immediately told them that the man had a gun, and he was now trying to break my window with it. The officer told me to hide in the bathroom if I was able to, and I did. All the noise woke up my aunt, and I frantically explained the situation to her, as the both of us hid in the bathroom. It was agonizing waiting for the police, but finally, I heard the police cars outside and let out a sigh of relief. It was faint, but I heard one gunshot, then shouting. It lasted about 5 minutes before it quieted down. After everything had settled and the officer on the line told me it was safe to go outside, I was greeted with a very shocking scene. The man who I saw, he was alive, but he had a gunshot wound, likely because he was attempting to use his gun on the police, and they fired back. At least, that's what I think happened. He was unconscious, but what the police found on his person was nothing short of terrifying. The man had a journal on him where he had details on every person who lived in the area. Details from what they looked like, to their assumed age, and why he thought they'd be a good target. So, my theory that he was just trying to creep us out was wrong. The man was likely attempting to lure someone out and kill them. He also had a few other weapons on him, and the man wasn't lanky or anything. He actually had muscle to him. While the police were explaining what they saw in the journal, I managed to catch a glimpse of his entry on me. It was disgusting. He thought I was much younger than I am, maybe only 17 or 18. I'm in my mid-20s, but to his credit, I don't look it. And he described me as cute, but worth taking out because I was such an easy target. It made me sick to my stomach that he stalked everyone here, essentially, but was only stopped from hurting someone because of me. What would have happened if I didn't call the police? The police confirmed that the other people living there had made complaints, but whenever they showed up, the man was nowhere to be found. It was likely only luck that he saw me and attempted to try and break in. As scary as it was, I like to think that it saved someone's life, or at least prevented them from being the ones to experience that. I don't know why he tried to approach me specifically, or why I was the only one he directly approached. I took one quick glance at the guy, and he was shoved in the back of the police car, just to see if I recognized him. And I did. He was one of the men who, during the day, would walk around all of the buildings while walking his dog. During the day, he didn't do much except walk his dog, and he seemed friendly enough. But at night, he tried terrorizing many people around the complex, apparently planning on taking people out one by one. I'm still in contact with the police, as I officially gave my statements, and may even have to appear in court. I'm not sure. I don't know what he will be charged with, since it's still early in the process. But I figured that the journal alone has a mountain of evidence regarding his intentions. But I'll never be able to forget that journal, how detailed it was, and how he sincerely seemed to have a plan for every single person on that list.
I am 17 years old now, but when this incident happened, I was 15 years old. It was a sunny day when my family and I decided to go to my aunt's house to hang out with family. I was very excited because I loved my aunt's house, and I loved spending time with my cousin. When we got there, my cousin and I planned a sleepover, so we went to the nearby store and bought some snacks. But when we were going back, a man called out to us. When we looked back, we saw a nice-looking man was there holding a pack of chips, which we dropped mistakenly. I went and took the pack of chips from him, and he gave us a genuine smile. I didn't think much about it after. By the time we got back, it was night already, and we were picking movies to watch. It was always comfortable in my aunt's house because she let the cool air flow in through the door. The main entrance has 2 doors and a space in between them. The first door is made of iron bars that air can flow through, and the second door is a normal wooden door, a few meters behind the iron door. My aunt always keeps the wooden door open so that the air can come through, but keeps the iron door locked for security. As we finally started to watch a movie, we heard a soft thud coming from the corridor between the main doors. An eerie feeling came over me, and I immediately asked my cousin if she had locked the iron door or not. She said she couldn't remember, so she got up and went to check it. A minute went by, but I didn't hear anything, so I got up to check on her, and my body froze. A man had broken into the house, and my cousin was unconscious on the floor. The man had a mask on, and he started to chase me. I ran and started shouting to alarm everyone that there was an intruder in the house. The man got faster, but I managed to run into the kitchen and lock the door behind me. My mom and aunt were also there. They were scared, and our mobile phones were kept in another room. The man kept banging on the door, and when the door didn't budge, I heard him walk away. I couldn't leave my cousin alone, so I gathered all the courage I had left, took a plate from the kitchen racks, opened the door, and rushed to the man. As he looked back, I smashed a plate onto his head, and blood started to pour down his head. I quickly grabbed my phone and called 911 and went to check on my cousin. I sprinkled some water on her face and she woke up. Fortunately, nothing serious happened to her. The police soon arrived and arrested the man. When they took the mask off of the man, I was shocked to see that it was the man who helped us when we went to the store. The police confirmed that he was following us and hid until we got into the house. He was a kidnapper who kidnapped young girls and sold them for money. I'm just happy that nothing bad happened to us. I realized that night that you shouldn't trust a stranger just because they are a bit nice to you. My name is Isaac. I'm from Australia, and this is a scary story I'd like to tell you. One day when I was in my early teens, a friend came over for a sleepover during school holidays. We decided to do some ding-dong ditching, which is going up to houses and knocking on the door or ringing the doorbell and then running off for hiding, since that's what kids our age got up to back then. After ding-dong ditching a few houses, we came up to an old, shabby-looking house at the top of a small hill. There was a driveway leading up to the house with a gray patrol SUV out front. Of course, it was my turn to go, so I walked up and looked for the door. Keep in mind, there were a lot of bushes out front, so I had to search for the door. I went on one side in front of the car and looked, but it turned out to be the side gate, which was open. I wasn't a real bad kid, so I didn't go in at all. But right as I turned around to go back down the driveway, a red, old and sporty car pulled up and drove up the driveway and saw me. The person driving it was about 20 or so, and in the passenger seat was a girl who was about the same age. Of course, he immediately got out of his car and walked up to me and started asking what I was doing and yelling at me. I was getting scared, thinking he was going to beat me up. I looked for my friend, but I saw him running away. I told him what we were doing and that I meant no harm, and he let me off with a warning. But this isn't where the story ends. A different day, maybe about a week later, I was riding my bike down near a park when I saw the red car again. I rode right past it, so I knew they saw me too. I rode away as fast as I could, but it chased me. I eventually got to the end of the road and went onto a path that led to a big loop around the lake that would lead back to the main road. While I was riding around the loop, I looked across the lake and saw the car sitting there, waiting for me at the exit. I panicked and quickly looked in the bushes and found a path made by other bike riders, so I went down there. I ended up getting home safely and didn't tell my parents. But later that evening, things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting in my room playing video games when all of a sudden I heard the loud engine of the car as it was pulling into our driveway. I quickly ran to the front door and looked through the front gate, and I saw the driver get out of the car. It was the same person who I saw at the park, and the passenger wasn't the girl. This time it was another guy who looked about the same age as the other. I told my parents to come out, and when they saw them, my mom called the cops. There was a gate in front of the door at my house, which we were looking at them through, and they walked right up to it. To my surprise, one of the men took out a metal pipe and started hitting the gate with full force. I screamed and locked the door. After 1 minute of continuous hitting, we heard the gate fly open. The only thing left for them to break before getting in was the old wooden door, which could be opened with just a kick. Just then, we heard police sirens and people yelling. After it all died down, we came out and saw the 2 men being arrested, and the look he gave me sent chills down my body. We later found out that the men were on drugs, and the driver had a gun and was planning to kill me. I've never been ding-dong ditching since. This is a story about an incident that I caused when I was a reckless teenager, and because of it, I still carry a terrible trauma with me. If I hadn't acted so foolishly back then, my life would have gone smoothly. I cannot help but recall that nightmare-like incident, even if I don't want to keep reliving it. It must have been about 15 years ago. I was around 17. At that time, my routine after school was to go to the arcade with my friends. On the day of the incident, I was happily playing a game called Tekken with my friends at the arcade, but there was also a man in his 30s playing the same game. I ended up competing with him at Tekken. At that time, I was known to be very good at Tekken. There was no one in the neighborhood who could beat me. As expected, the man was completely defeated by me, and I could see him gritting his teeth in anger. He kept challenging me, and I kept winning. Then, he suddenly started to bang his fists on the monitor and roared. Then he yelled at me,
"Do you want to fight me in real life instead of playing a game?"
But I burst out laughing, because he was clearly a big man in his 30s, but his voice sounded like a child's. Then he suddenly grabbed me by the collar, as if he was more angry at my laughter. I was flustered by his aggression, and my friends who were watching started trying to stop him. Then, the man's expression suddenly became very stern, and the sound of his voice did a 180. He said in a very deep, rumbling, low voice,
"Are you the one who made Max mad?"
I swallowed hard, confused by the sudden change in his demeanor. At that moment, I thought this man was mentally ill, and I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. I was scared because he was a big man. When I apologized, the man's eyes and expression suddenly changed to gentleness again. He let go of my collar and said,
I'm sorry, my friends are too hot-tempered. I'll stop them, so please go.
Then he continued to mutter to himself, his voice changing every few seconds.
I'm angry.
Don't be angry. I'm going to kill that guy.
No, please don't do that.
Let's kill him. No, just hit him a few times.
Should I hit him?
No, you stay still.
I still can't forget the chill running down my spine as I watched the scene in front of me. I was about to leave the arcade when the man suddenly shouted,
Where are you going, you punk? Max keeps crying because of you. Let's play another round of Tekken.
When I turned around in surprise, the man was running towards me with tears in his eyes. I screamed, and the man threw himself at me and swung his fist. I barely managed to avoid it, but he didn't stop. Some of my friends ran over and started fighting with the guy, and I heard someone calling the police. I should have run away then, but I was too young and made a bad call. I was angry and punched him back. He fell back after being hit by my punch, and he seemed to be unconscious for a moment. After a moment, he opened his eyes and started shouting in an unrecognizable language. Then he suddenly jumped at my friend Frank and pushed him. Frank fell back, hitting his head on the game's console and falling to the floor. I could see blood flowing from his head. I was terrified and froze in place. Then the guy suddenly shouted in a woman's voice,
Everyone, please stop. Do you want to go to jail again?
Then he pointed at me again and said in a deep, manly voice,
We have to kill him. He made Max mad. Max is still crying.
Then he shouted something in Chinese and looked around wildly. It seemed like he was looking for something. I was scared and stuck next to my friends. Then he shouted again in a deep, manly voice.
Xia Hao is looking for a knife right now. He said he'll cut you up. This guy used to run a butcher shop. Do you know what I mean? There are 7 of us. Do you think you can beat us?
After a while, the police arrived, and the man's eyes and facial expressions suddenly became softer, and he spoke to the police in a very kind voice. The police looked at the man and said he seemed like a good person, and asked us if he really had been violent, and they had a hard time believing it. However, due to the testimonies of many witnesses, the guy was eventually arrested. I also went to the police station for questioning, and there the guy continued behaving like a nice person in front of the police. I couldn't tell if it was just an act or if the man was being genuine. Anyway, after that day, I never went to the arcade again and stopped playing games completely. And I suffered terrible trauma from the stress of the situation and the guilt of what happened to my friend. What on earth was that man's true identity? Were all of them true? Hi, Wansee. I'm a huge fan of your channel, and I love all of your animated stories. By the way, this incident did not happen to me, but to my grandmother. Recently, my grandma came to live with us, and since then, she has told me a lot of her numerous encounters with the paranormal. This particular encounter happened in 1974 in Anambra State, Nigeria. My grandma was in her late 40s at the time. It was a Saturday when she received a call from the local hospital. A nurse on the phone told her that her daughter, my aunt, who was pregnant, was in labor, and that her presence was needed at the hospital. It was raining out, but it seemed urgent, so my grandma began making her way there quickly. According to her, the hospital was around a 15-minute walk from her house. She was making her way there by foot, and as time went on, the rain only became more and more aggressive. The streets were empty and flooded, and there were no vehicles in sight. My grandma said she was frightened to walk through the flood since it was dangerous, but she also didn't want to abandon her daughter at the hospital. Caught in a dilemma, she stood at the side of the road, not sure of what to do. Then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a white van came and stopped beside her. She explained that she didn't notice any cars coming, and so she was surprised to see the white van there. Inside the van, there was a man dressed in a uniform, like a security guard uniform. He asked her where she was going, and she told him she needed to be at the hospital down the road. The man told her to get in, and she did. As soon as she got to the hospital, she got out of the van, thanked the man, and began to make her way to the entrance of the hospital. Upon getting there, she met her friend who had also come earlier upon hearing that my aunt was in labor. Her friend was surprised to see her, and she asked her how she got to the hospital through the heavy rain. My grandma told her that someone was kind enough to drop her off. She turned to point toward the street where the van was supposed to be, but to her surprise, the van wasn't there. It was almost like it had vanished into thin air. The strangest part was that my grandma's friend was confused and said she hadn't seen or heard any van. The road was long and straight, so if one were to look down the road at that moment, they should have been able to catch a glimpse of the van driving down the street in the distance. But when my grandma looked, there was no van, nobody. The road was empty, and the rain was still pouring. She told me anytime she remembers this event, it sends shivers down her spine. And to this day, she doesn't know who that man was, where the van came from, or why it helped her to get to the hospital on that rainy day. My name is Giovanna, and I'm from Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. I had a terrifying experience that I will tell you about in this story. I was 17 when it happened, and now I'm 27. It's been 10 years, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. To make the sequence of events clearer, let me explain the layout of our apartment. It is quite small, only 35 square meters, and has one large, narrow corridor that connects all the rooms. You can hear everything from anywhere in the apartment. At the time when this happened, I was living with my parents. One morning, I was woken up by the sound of dishes being washed, and I knew it was my dad because my mom was at work. I was lying in bed, gathering the strength to get up, and as I usually always sleep with the bedroom door open or at least ajar, I saw my dad entering the bathroom in a hurry. After a few moments, I heard him washing his hands in the bathroom, but at the same time, I still heard someone washing the dishes in the kitchen. This was confusing for me because my dad and I were alone in the apartment, and it took me a few moments to think about what I was hearing. I got up to check what was going on and who else was at home, thinking maybe it was my mom who stayed home and didn't go to work. I got to my bedroom door, from where I could see the entrance to the bathroom and my dad washing his hands at the sink. Something seemed strange about him. He was smiling at himself in the mirror. I interrupted him by wishing him good morning and asked him what he was doing, to which he replied,
"I'm washing my hands."
And the whole time, he had a strange look in his eyes and a slightly creepy smile. I thought maybe he was joking with me or something had made him laugh, but the feeling in my stomach told me that something was wrong. Then, after we made eye contact for a few moments, I asked him, "But Dad, who's washing the dishes in the kitchen?" What he said left me traumatized forever. He said, with an even bigger smile,
"Also me."
At that moment, my heart nearly stopped, and I ran to the kitchen where I saw my dad washing the dishes again, and I started to cry. He wiped his hands and started questioning me about what happened. He tried to convince me that what I saw was just a dream, but I knew it was not a dream. I am convinced that it was some demon trying to impersonate my father. Hi, this is the story of a scary experience I had when I was 11 years old. I was an introverted girl with no friends, so I would play by myself. I have a little sister who was 6 years old at the time and was sick for some reason which I didn't know. One night, my parents had taken her to the hospital while I stayed home alone. It was around 7 in the evening and I was playing with my remote control car in the hallway, running after it throughout the whole house. After a while, I got tired and sat on the couch and rested my head on the back. I closed my eyes and was resting when I suddenly felt cold. I shrugged it off and figured that it was just the wind, so I just stayed still. Suddenly, I felt someone breathing heavily in my ear. I heard a whisper of something that I couldn't quite make out then. I jumped from the couch, shocked, and looked around. There was a window in the room that we often opened, so I seriously thought it was just a strong wind. But the voice that whispered and breathed heavily came in my right ear, and the window was on my left and was completely shut. I was scared and confused, didn't understand what it was. I told my parents when they got home, and they said that I was just hallucinating and should stop watching horror movies at night. But let me tell you, this does not end here. After a few months, I was sleeping with my mom on my bed while my dad and sister were in a different bedroom. I was sleeping peacefully when the same heavy breathing started again. This time, I heard a deep voice whisper loudly into my ear the word,
Hell.
I woke up screaming, and my mom, who had been asleep next to me, hugged me tightly. I was crying and told her about it. My parents listened and were worried, seeing me that scared. I am 20 now, and we no longer live in that house. But what I heard gave me a long-lasting fear. When I sleep, I have to cover my ear with a blanket, even when it's warm in the summer, because I don't want to hear that voice ever again.
In my dad's 2-story wood cabin, there was something hidden under the bed downstairs. But what was hiding there isn't the scary part of the story. Under the bed was my dad's 12-gauge shotgun, which he kept there in the Coco bedroom downstairs for various reasons. For context, the Coco bedroom is named after the pet bird we keep in there. The story begins with the day my friends and I decided we wanted to hang out and take a break from our jobs. I asked my dad if it would be okay if we stayed in his cabin, and he allowed it but asked that we be careful. A few days later, we headed out and eventually arrived at the cabin and brought our stuff inside. We immediately got ready to go fishing, and later on we built a campfire, played music on our guitars, told jokes, etc. We were having a great time. Eventually, it was getting late, so we decided to put out the fire and go to bed. Our friend group was 2 guys including myself and 3 girls. And to keep everyone's name private, let's call the other guy A and the girls B, C, and D. A and I slept in the Coco room, and the girls slept in the other bedroom upstairs. While I was sleeping, A woke me up and said that he heard someone talking outside. I told him that he was just tired, and that maybe it was just an animal scavenging food we left outside by the campfire. But as I was telling him this, I heard the doorknob on the front door of the cabin start shaking loudly. I got goosebumps up my arms, and I looked at A and he was breathing heavily. I got out my dad's 12-gauge shotgun from under the bed and loaded it and cocked it. A looked at me and said, "Are you going to shoot them?" I replied, "If they are going to hurt us, I might have to." Then I told A to get the large knife from the kitchen, and we walked up to the front door. Just as we were about to open it, the front door swung open and there were 2 skinny men standing there. One of them was older, probably in his 50s, wearing a plain black shirt, and was holding some kind of homemade knife, and the other guy was younger, possibly in his 20s. I couldn't see him completely because he was standing behind the older guy, but I could tell that he was holding some kind of a big weapon. As soon as I saw them, I backed up and pointed the gun at the 2 guys, and A also pointed the knife at them. We sat there, frozen, without saying a single word for what felt like a whole minute. So I spoke and told them, "F off or I will blow your heads off." They both panicked and ran into the woods. After we confirmed that they were really gone, A and I gasped for air as if we hadn't breathed for a long time. I told A to go check on the girls and decided to go outside, still holding my dad's 12-gauge, to check around the cabin. I then went inside and told A that I didn't see anything, and he said that the girls were still asleep. A little shocked, I said, "Wow, after all that commotion, they're still sleeping?" A and I decided to tell the girls what happened when they woke up in the morning. Maybe because of the adrenaline and maybe because of the fear, A and I didn't sleep a wink that night. When the girls woke up, we told them what happened, and naturally, they were shocked and scared. We decided to cut our stay at the cabin short and go home that day. When we got home, I told my dad what happened and he scolded me for not calling the police. But he was also glad that we all came back alive and well. My dad then called his friend who was a cop and reported what happened. My dad told me to call A and to come to our house so he could also give a statement about the 2 men in the incident. It's been 2 years since that incident now. My friend and I still hang out once in a while, but A and I will never forget that incident. One day when we were hanging out, A said to me, "What do you think would happen if your dad's 12-gauge hadn't been there?" And to this day, I am afraid to imagine the answer.
It was the middle of the summer. My parents had left for the weekend to go to our house in Cape Cod. It's about a 2-hour drive away, so it's no big deal for them to leave me alone for a few days. My mom had made some pulled pork and pasta for me to heat up, to eat whenever, and I had some money if I wanted to order pizza. Things were all good. The first night I was alone, I stayed up till about 3 in the morning playing Xbox, so I woke up really late the next day. I checked my phone, and when I woke up, I saw it was a little past 1. I had made plans to play some street hockey with 3 of my friends, so I threw myself out of the bed and I stumbled into the shower. I take really long showers, so when my parents are gone, I go crazy. I was in there for about 45 minutes on my phone, scrolling through Reddit and Twitter. And I mean, Twitter. So then I heard my front door open out of nowhere. The bathroom is directly up the stairs from the back door. And the thing is, it's pretty loud when it opens and closes. I immediately froze since obviously I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes. My ears trained in, trying to hear anything. I heard nothing. I figured it was just the wind or maybe my parents were home early. So I turned off the shower, wrapped my towel around myself, and slowly walked down the stairs to check it out. So the stairs to the kitchen are pretty tight and walled in. So it's essentially like walking down a tighter version of a regular stairwell. So I can't see into the kitchen when I walk down. Even though my house is old as shit, and each step on the stairs makes a super loud creak, I still took my time and tried to be as quiet as possible. I probably took about 45 seconds walking down all 12 stairs. So when I get to the second to the last stairs, I take a little breather and compose myself. In my mind, I knew I was being stupid. There obviously wasn't anything in the kitchen. There's no way I wouldn't have heard another noise. And there's no reason for them to still be in the kitchen, even if there were burglars or something in my house. After sort of mentally chastising myself for being such a wuss, I sort of chuckled to myself for being so stupid and just normally walked the last 2 stairs, and I turned the corner into the kitchen. Standing about 2 feet away from me, in the middle of my kitchen, is a man staring straight at me, perfectly still, with a massive smile on his face, just staring at me. The thing I remember most vividly wasn't his face or his smile, but his arms. They weren't just at his side. He held them in the strangest, most abnormal position I've ever seen. They were where one would normally hold their arms, but he had rotated them to the point where they were almost completely reversed, as well as lifting them up behind himself. I don't know why I remember this so much, but it's just the most demonic, abnormal position I've ever seen. Honest to God, I think I almost had a heart attack right there. Looking back, I can realize how creepy this situation was, but in the moment, I just took a step toward him and punched him as hard as I could in the jaw, sort of half slapping / pushing him towards the ground. The second I connected, I beelined up the stairs, dropping my towel in the kitchen with my heart beating out of control, running up the stairs naked as hell. I sprinted into my room and locked the door behind me. I quickly put a chair up against the doorknob, like you see on TV. Almost without thinking, I immediately called 911. Nearly in tears, I told the operator what happened. As I sat on the floor of my room, practically in the fetal position, staring at the door, praying that the cop would be here soon, I noticed a light coming from the gap between my door. It had stopped. This dude was standing outside of my bedroom door. There's no words to describe the feeling I had. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the shadows across the bottom of the door shift in tiny ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, naked, praying the man would go away for what seemed like an hour. All the while the 911 operator was asking, "Hello, sir? Are you there? Hello?" I didn't want to make a noise. And even if I wanted to move my arms to bring the phone to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually the light returned to the gap, and I heard the faintest of footsteps slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak, naked. I heard banging on the front door and the sound of 2 officers entering my house. I finally felt safe and opened the door to 2 of them standing there, and I jumped on them and wrapped my legs around them. I almost cried. I was naked. Nowadays, my parents don't even leave me home alone, thank God. And I check every lock on the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still, but I'm doing all right. even working with sketch artists and a few lineups. The police never found whoever this guy was in my house. That sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside, half expecting to see him standing across the street smiling under a lamppost. I have no idea what he wanted or who he was, but regardless, that was the scariest night of my life.
This is an incident that happened on a rainy day when I was in 3rd grade. At the time, and in general when I was a kid, I didn't really believe in ghosts and such. On that rainy day, I had just gotten home from school, and I decided to finish all my assignments before I watched TV and played on my Nintendo DS. After I finished all my assignments, I took a peek into the kitchen to see whether my mom was home yet.
"Ma, can you turn on the TV?"
I asked when I saw her cooking dinner. "Sure," she replied. She walked to the living room and turned on the TV for me. Then she went back to the kitchen and continued preparing dinner. I played on my Nintendo DS while the TV was on in the background. I was having fun playing Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, when suddenly I saw a tall, dark figure in my peripheral vision. I was too focused on the game until I noticed that the figure was slowly walking towards me. I stopped playing and looked at it, but I didn't move my head from its position so it wouldn't be obvious that I was looking. It was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and black pants. I wasn't scared at all until I saw the upper parts of its body. The figure was headless. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. I was so scared that I couldn't move. My mind wasn't working. What do I do? I asked myself repeatedly. I wanted to shout, but my mouth felt like it was glued shut. The moment I turned my head to face the figure is a moment I will never forget. The figure was bent and contorted and walking strangely, and the image of it is burned into my memory. I closed my eyes and prayed that the figure would go away. Fortunately, when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. I ran to my mom, crying. She asked me, "What happened?" Then I told her about the terrifying figure that I had seen. Looking at her expression, my mom didn't seem so surprised.
"The figure that you saw was one of our ancestors. Maybe he just wanted to visit the house,"
she said. Still shaken up by what I'd seen, I asked,
"Why doesn't he have a head?" "You're too young to know the whole story,"
she replied.
My name is Ami. This incident happened to me when I was in college. I was 20 years old, living alone in my college housing. It was just another ordinary day for me. I had just finished my classes and decided to stop by the nearest grocery store to pick up a few things before heading home. As I walked through the aisles, I noticed a man with bloodshot eyes and torn clothes staring at me from a distance. His eerie smile gave me chills, and I could feel his gaze following me around the store. I tried to brush it off and quickly grabbed what I needed before making my way to the checkout. As I stood in line, I could feel his presence getting closer and closer. It was then that he leaned in close to me and whispered something in my ear that I couldn't quite make out. Feeling uneasy, I hurriedly paid for my items and rushed to my car in the parking lot. As I was about to get in, I heard footsteps behind me and turned around to see the man from the store charging towards me with a knife in his hand. I managed to dodge his attack and scramble into my car, locking the doors behind me. He pounded on the windows and screamed obscenities as I frantically tried to start the car and escape. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to get away and called the police as soon as I was a safe distance away. The police searched the area, but they couldn't find the man. I was terrified and couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, watching me. Days went by, and I tried my best to move on, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, a thunderstorm rolled in. The rain pounded against my window, and every time there was a bolt of lightning, it illuminated my room like daylight. I woke up at around 5 or 6 a.m., startled by a particularly loud thunderclap that shook the entire house. As I tried to calm myself down and go back to sleep, I noticed a strange shadow on the wall. It was in the shape of a human, but something about it seemed off. As the lightning flashed again, I saw the silhouette of a man standing outside my window, his face pressed up against the glass, watching me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze in terror. Suddenly, I saw him. The man from the store was standing outside my window, holding his knife and staring at me with that same twisted smile. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. as he disappeared with each subsequent bolt of lightning. I knew I had to do something, so I bolted out of bed and ran to the front door to make sure it was locked, but it was too late. As I turned around, I saw the man standing in my living room, his twisted grin wider as he pointed his knife at me. I was trapped, cornered, with nowhere to go. The crazy man then charged at me, shouting, "You are mine! You are mine! You are mine!" I fell to the ground, paralyzed by fear, and then he got on top of me and whispered in my ear calmly,
I got you.
He then started laughing maniacally. He started cutting my clothes off with his knife. I couldn't move. His strength overpowered me. Just when I thought it was all over, I heard a loud thud and saw the man fall to the ground. I then saw my neighbor on top of the man punching him. He then strangled the man until he went unconscious. After seeing the man unconscious on the floor, a feeling of relief washed over my body. I asked my neighbor how he knew I was in danger. Apparently, he had woken up from the loud storm and had gone into the kitchen to get some water when, through the window, he saw the man standing around the building I lived in and became concerned. He grabbed his coat and went outside to follow him and watched from afar to see what was going on. After seeing him enter my building, he rushed in behind him and saved my life. I called the police, and they arrived quickly, arresting the man and taking him away. It wasn't until later that they told me he had just been released after 30 years in prison for attempted murder and assault. The whole ordeal left me traumatized, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched for months afterwards. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night and the man who almost took my life. And I can't even imagine what might have happened if my neighbor hadn't shown up at that moment.
Hi, Wansee. This is something that happened to me at the arcade about 3 years ago. If I could put it into words how I feel about what happened, I would just tell you that after that day, I never went back to the arcade again. Back then, I used to go to the arcade maybe once every few months. I don't remember exactly why I went to the arcade the day this incident happened, but I think there was a new game that came out that I wanted to play. After work, I headed straight to the arcade. Once I arrived, I played various games and was enjoying myself. Eventually, I got a little tired and crouched down in a corner to rest for a while. While I was sitting, a man walked up to me and stood still. From my view on the floor, he looked ordinary. But even today, I remember the twisting feeling in my stomach the moment I looked up and saw his face. He asked me,
"Want to buy a doll?"
I asked what kind of doll it was. He looked around and then showed me his phone. On the screen, it was a picture of something like a display case with people's heads on it. No torso, just the heads. I got goosebumps. It looked so real that I felt sick. But of course, I thought these were dolls, not real people. He whispered to me,
"If you're interested in buying, send me a message."
He gave me a small business card that had his email address on it, and written on the card was dolls for sale. I kept my calm on the outside and told him, these dolls aren't really my style, and tried to leave by scooting around him. But he grabbed my shoulder and kept talking.
"Then why don't you come to my office with me? If you actually see them, I'm sure you'll want one."
He laughed and mimicked slitting someone's throat by dragging his thumb across his neck. At that point, I just walked away. He watched me walk away and then left the building. And I went back to playing. I think I'd played for quite a while after that. Eventually, it was past midnight and there were hardly any people left in the arcade. I was tired, so I decided to leave and started walking out of the arcade to go home. As I walked out, I saw a group of shady-looking guys in the parking lot. At first, they were talking and I thought they didn't notice me. But just a second or two later, I saw the guy from before among them. He pointed at me and said some words that I couldn't hear, and all at once, they turned towards me. Their murderous grins burned through me, and the twisting feeling in my stomach came back in full force. I pretended not to see them and shuffled quickly into my car, but then I heard the man yell,
"Hey, I want to display your head in my office too. What do you think?"
The guys all started laughing maniacally. When I turned around in surprise, he was staring at me, waving me over to where they were standing. I kept going towards my car, but the guys around him were slowly walking towards me. I turned around and saw them pulling syringes out of their jacket pockets. My heart sank, but I pretended not to care and started fast walking towards my car. Then they started running towards me, clearly trying to outpace me. Then a van started up and started coming towards me. The men in the van were wearing aprons, like those worn by butchers. I ran like crazy at that point to get in the car. I got in and immediately turned it on and stepped on the gas. As I left the parking lot, they stopped chasing me. I watched them in my rearview mirror. Some of the men went to the van and took a cooler out of the trunk. I was still scared, but I was curious to know what they were doing. So I parked the car about a block away and watched them with binoculars I kept in the car from when I go hiking. After a while, they met another man and gave him the cooler, and the man gave them a black bag. Then they took a bunch of cash out of the black bag and divided it amongst themselves. It definitely seemed like something illicit was going on, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it since I was still freaked out from how they all approached me. After that, I just headed home and tried not to think too hard about it. From that day on, I never went near that arcade again, and thankfully I never saw those men again. But since that day, I've occasionally wondered about the truth of what I saw and experienced that day. Was the photo the man showed me real? What was in that cooler? And what I've wondered most is, what on earth would they have done to me if I hadn't gotten away? Hello, my name is Angie. I am from Albania, and this is a story from when I was 11 or 12 years old. It was summertime, and my family and I were staying at my grandparents' house for the weekend. It also happened that my aunt and her kids would be staying there for the weekend too. One night at around 10 p.m., my cousins and I decided to play hide and seek. It didn't take long to find everyone, except for my cousin Edith. For context, behind my grandparents' house on either side is a tall wall. No one is supposed to be able to enter the yard from back there. The only way in is from the front of the house. My grandparents live in a rural area, and criminal activities are often reported to take place there. And even though the walls were there, as kids, we were still scared to go too far back there. We were all working together to find Edith, when I saw a hand in the bushes at the back of the house, and I thought it was Edith. I did find it quite a bit odd, because the hand seemed to be rather big, and all my cousins were around my age, but I didn't really question it. When I saw the hand, I screamed, "I know where Edith is!" I was quite proud of myself for finding her, but just a moment later, I heard Edith get up and yell, "You found me!" She was actually hiding in a bush around the front of the house. I was terrified because everyone was in front of the house at that moment. We all were scared to go to the back, so I couldn't help but to think, who was that back there? But I didn't say anything to anyone about what I saw. After that game, our grandma called us to come inside since it was very dark. Edith and another cousin, Sarah, and I slept together on a mattress on the floor, with a window right above us. Just like everyone, we stayed up late talking. I did tell them about what I saw, but they told me I was lying and just continued on with the girl talk. I got tired at around 1 a.m. and so did my cousins. As I was falling asleep, I heard some unexpected footsteps outside the house. I tried to ignore them, but they didn't stop and were getting louder. When I got fed up with the noises, I got up and looked out the window, expecting it to be my cousins pranking us. But what I saw were two unfamiliar men. When I made eye contact with them and realized what was happening, I screamed at the top of my lungs as loud as I could. The men ran away and everyone in the house woke up. I started crying and explained what happened to my mother, but she just told me I probably had a nightmare. I was so frustrated that no one believed me. As a teenager, I forgot that this all happened until almost 10 years later when I was at a family reunion at my grandparents' house. Being there brought back those memories, and while talking with my grandfather, I jokingly mentioned the scary things I saw that night. Then my grandfather told me the truth behind it all. Apparently, at the time of the incident, my grandfather was involved in some illegal activities and some people were after him, but no one in the family knew. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. It all happened one summer on what could have been just a normal night. My brother's two friends were sleeping over, so my mom and I decided to get a pizza to make it easy to feed everyone. My mom and I decided to get the pizza from a popular pizza chain in Arizona called Fired Pie. We all decided that we would take the pizza to go and eat it at home, and we brought my brother's friends and our dog, a husky named Frosty, with us to pick up the pizza. The reason we didn't leave Frosty at the house was that he was still young and very destructive when left alone. But it turned out that bringing Frosty with us meant more than just not having to buy new blinds or shoes. When we arrived at Fired Pie, I didn't want to get out of the car because I was feeling very lazy, but my mom and my brother didn't want to leave me alone in the car. But since Frosty couldn't go inside the restaurant anyway, he stayed in the car with me and I convinced them that I would be fine. The place where we parked was very dark, and I was in the back seat with Frosty, partially almost lying down and scrolling on my phone. Suddenly, Frosty started to whine and then barked a few times. At first, I thought he was being paranoid because he was little and felt trapped in the car. I just patted him on the back and that calmed him down a little. But then he started to bark aggressively at me and I was taken aback. I shifted over to pet Frosty again when the reflection of my phone in the side view mirror caught my eyes. As I looked over at the mirror, I saw something terrifying. In the reflection, I could see a man wearing a black hoodie and ski mask staring right at me. I screamed and turned around and saw that man was trying to open the door. Thankfully, it was locked. He then screamed, "Open up the door!" I was so scared. I was only 14 at that time and didn't know how to react or what to do. Frosty stepped on me as he was barking at the man and I came back to reality. I realized that if I didn't do something quickly, then something bad would happen. I gathered up some courage and told the man to go away and that I would call the cops if he didn't. Suddenly, everything got very quiet. He seemed to have left and I looked around and didn't see anyone around. So I got out of the car with my dog and started running towards the restaurant. But as I was running, someone grabbed me and I tried to scream, but my mouth was covered by a cloth. The last thing I saw was my dog running to the restaurant and then I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital and my body felt achy and like I'd been thrown around. I looked around and saw my mom and my brother, who seemed very concerned about me. I then asked them what had happened. They told me that Frosty came running to the restaurant and was noticed by the waiters at the door. When my mom and brother saw Frosty, they were very scared as they knew something must have happened. They ran to the parking lot and saw that I wasn't in the car. My mom called the cops and then Frosty suddenly started barking at a shady-looking van nearby. My brother and his friends circled the van to look inside, and they saw blood on the back door of the van. They found the back of the van and found me, tightly tied up with ropes. Suddenly, the attacker came around the van with a knife, and I can only guess that he was looking for more victims. When my brother saw the man holding a knife, he immediately attacked him out of anger, while his friends came from behind him and held back his arms and took the knife. Meanwhile, my mother was trying to get the ropes off of me. Later, the police arrived and stopped the fight, then arrested the attacker while I was transported to the hospital. The investigation later revealed that the man was a sex offender, drug dealer, and a human trafficker. He was most likely planning to kidnap and sell me. I'm so thankful to Frosty, and to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if we decided to leave him at the house. Most likely, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story.
I used to work as a waitress from 1990 to 1991 as a part-time job while I was completing my associate degree in business. Although I made friends at my job, I didn't really like it because I was only getting paid $7.25 an hour. Every day went the same exact way, except one day would stick with me until the day I vanished from this earth. I was working one night and I saw a dusty couple along with a teenage girl enter the restaurant. I sat them down at the table. As they all sat down, the girl accidentally pushed her fork off the table. I picked it up for her, and as she took it from me, she grabbed my hand pretty firm while taking the fork from me. I didn't think too much of it at first, and just continued my shift. I came by near the table again when I was on my way to grab someone's food, and the girl again dropped her fork. I thought it must have been a coincidence, and I gave it back to her, and she took the fork again from me, and also squeezed my hand again. Though this time, it was more firm. I walked by their table 2 more times, and both times, she would also drop her fork. And both times, I picked it up for her. And she would squeeze my hand both times, but after every squeeze, it felt tighter and tighter each time as she did it. Now I knew she was doing it intentionally. Something had to have been wrong, but it was hard to tell at that very moment. Not too much later, they eventually finished their meals and all 3 of them had left the restaurant. I went over to their table to clean it, and as I picked up the plate, I saw that there was a napkin under the plate, and it had words on it, and it said, "Help me, call the police." My mind was now racing with dark thoughts. Was this girl kidnapped? Was she trying to escape her captors? Who were those people that she was with? It was so hard to process what was going on. The whole week I thought about this girl. I felt so bad for not realizing the situation she was actually in. It kept hitting me like a bullet. The more I thought about her, I made a very disturbing resemblance. That girl, she looked so familiar. That's when I connected the dots. I recognized this girl to be a missing person for years now. It had to be none other than Antoinette Cadito. Her whole face and body physique matched her description. Every night before I go to bed, I always remember that encounter. I kept feeling like I was the worst person in the world. I should have picked up on her hints that she was in trouble. I could have ended her suffering of being kidnapped, and I could have helped return her to her loved ones. Antoinette's mother, Penny, had died in 1999 due to cardiac and liver issues. Now that I think about this case more, I strongly believe that her mother had something to do with her disappearance. She had to have sold her daughter. Every interview, she didn't look concerned with her daughter being abducted and held against her will. I feel sick to my stomach every time I think about this. It is still unknown where Antoinette is as of today. This mystery has never been solved. Although law enforcement officials and I believe she is deceased, she is still listed as a missing person. I just really hope that wherever Antoinette is today, that she has found peace, and I hope that she is no longer living a life of pain.
This is not my story, it's my father's. Back in the 90s, my father was studying at a university in Calcutta while my grandparents lived in another state. The apartment he lived in was on the 4th floor with a balcony separated from the living room by a door. The balcony provided both light and a cool breeze, so my dad would often leave the door to the balcony open and sit on the sofa while he was doing his work. The day the incident occurred, there was a blackout in the area caused by a storm. It was late when it happened, so the apartment was cast into pitch blackness. While the summers were cooler back in the day, it was still pretty hot. So Dad decided to leave the balcony door and windows in his bedroom open to circulate cool air. He usually closed the door and shut the windows every night before bed, but he decided to make that night an exception. He woke up sometime in the middle of the night, sweating. His instincts told him that something was off, so he tried to figure out what woke him up. Suddenly, the urge to answer nature's call hit him, and with a pit in his stomach, he left the room. The washroom was kind of far away from his room. It was on the other end of the apartment, and he'd have to pass by the living room to get there. As he was walking past the sofa, he looked over and froze. The balcony door was open, and a cool breeze was hitting him as he had hoped. What he had not hoped for was to see people sitting on his sofa. Well, maybe not people, but things. There were around 3 to 4 figures sitting on his sofa. He could not make out what they looked like. They seemed to be blending in and out of the shadows, changing shape. What scared him more was that he could tell they were all looking at him. They didn't have visible eyes, but he could feel their stare on him. He contemplated running back to his room, but his bladder was strongly against that idea. Cursing, he shut his eyes tightly, ran to the washroom, did his business, and ran back, feeling the stares on him again as he ran past the sofa. He locked the door of his room, got in bed, and tried his best to go to sleep. When he woke up, it was morning and the skies were clear. He shakily went to the living room, but saw nothing out of place. The balcony door was still open, letting bright light flood into the room. He never told my grandparents about his experiences, as he didn't want to make them worry. The only people close to him who know about this are my mom and me. You might think that he left the apartment soon after this happened, but he stayed there until he completed his undergraduate degree and never had a repeat of that experience. He did, however, always close the balcony door at night from then on, with no exceptions. During his stay in the apartment after the event, he did some research into the history of the building, but came up with nothing. The building had not been built on burial grounds. There weren't any records of murder, suicides, or fatal accidents. This eventually made him chalk up the incident to a bad dream or some sort of hallucination. But I sometimes wonder if the things he saw weren't just a figment of imagination. What if they were real? Hello, Wansee. My name is Kai, and I'm currently living in the Philippines. The incident I'm about to recount occurred 5 years ago, but it continues to haunt me to this day. It all began when I left on a 5-day trip to Bicol with my boyfriend and 5 friends. The first 3 days were fantastic as we explored various islands, visited tourist spots, savored chili ice cream, and even rode ATVs to see Mount Mayon. On the fourth night, we visited Albay and stayed at one of our friends' abandoned houses. The place seemed unthreatening except for the cockroaches that scurried about when our friend switched on the lights. The house was covered in dust due to being abandoned. To sleep, my friends and I decided to set up beds in the living room. Once we arranged our beds, my boyfriend, the 3 other guys, and I opted to have a drink while the 2 female friends had already fallen asleep in the living room. We were having a good time, engrossed in conversation, when suddenly my attention was drawn to a shadow on the wall. Shadows aren't typically attention-grabbing, but there was something peculiar about this one. It appeared darker than the rest. Intrigued, I nudged my friends, but the shadow remained motionless. One of them grew curious and asked, "What's wrong?" I pointed at the shadow and said, "Whose shadow is that?" It dawned on all of us that the shadow didn't belong to any of us, and we were all stunned. Even as we stood up, the shadow remained unmoving, and after 30 seconds, it simply vanished. My friends and I were unsure about what exactly had happened. Were we all intoxicated and having some kind of shared hallucination? However, that couldn't be correct, since one of us hadn't even been drinking, and yet he witnessed the same thing we did. We decided to brush it off and try to go to sleep. I lay beside my already fast asleep boyfriend, but I simply couldn't sleep that night due to what had occurred. Despite knowing that we had to wake up early the next day, I forced myself to sleep. As I turned to face my boyfriend, I suddenly felt a poke on my back. I turned around and saw a man, possibly in his 30s, smiling at me. I was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. He was also lying down, looking at me. The terror overwhelmed me and I lost consciousness. I woke up the next day to my boyfriend shaking me gently. He urged me to get ready or else we would miss the bus. When I shared what had happened to me the previous night with my boyfriend and friends, their expressions revealed their shock. They all mentioned hearing a man's laughter throughout the night. They said the laughter was so loud that it felt as if the person was in the same room as us.
This happened when I was still a debt collector for a motorcycle company. I was assigned to a remote area, but this time it was a town frequented by tourists. Every day I woke up at 5 a.m. and drove for 3 hours to reach the town where our branch was located. My routine was always the same. I visited clients, collected payments, reminded them of due dates, and handed over the money I collected to the office. I hated being in that branch, mostly because the cashier always took his sweet time with his paperwork, causing me to drive home late at night. Riding a motorcycle late at night isn't something anyone enjoys. Besides the bugs flying into your face, you often get blinded by motorists with unnecessarily bright headlights. One day I had to go home late again because the cashier had gone out with a friend, leaving his job unfinished, as usual. I hated him every time he did that. After he finally returned and finished his work, he handed me the money I needed to bring to the main office. It was already 9 p.m. I cursed under my breath as I started the long drive home. While driving along the pitch-dark winding road, my headlights suddenly flickered. "Ah, crap, not now," I muttered. I stopped for a moment, tapping the headlight, and thankfully, it stopped flickering. I continued driving, but as I navigated the dark road, I felt something swoop overhead. I looked up but didn't see anything. Just before I reached a sharp bend, something swooped down again, hitting my helmet and knocking me off. And at the same time, my headlight went out. I slid and crashed on the side of the road. The darkness was so thick I could barely see a thing. I stood up, dusting myself off, and sitting behind a tree. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the night. Thanks to the moonlight, I was able to see my motorcycle. But before I could move towards it, a large bird suddenly landed beside it. The bird was massive, about as big as me. It hopped around my motorcycle. I noticed that my helmet wasn't far from where I'd crashed. I stayed hidden behind the tree, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What kind of bird grows that big and flies after dark? It wasn't like any bird I'd ever seen. It had a head like a turkey, and its feathers were as black as the night itself. As it neared my helmet, my jaw dropped. It reached out to my helmet, not with its feet or beak, but with what appeared to be a hand that came out from under its wing. I watched in terror as it picked up my helmet, only to drop it when it heard a car approaching. The bird flew away just before the car passed by. I took the opportunity to run to my motorcycle. I started it up, relieved that the light worked again, and rushed away, leaving my helmet behind. In a panic, I kept looking around, scared the bird would swoop down on me again. When I reached the main office, I handed over the money to the manager, who was standing outside the dormitories. He asked why I looked so dirty, and why I wasn't wearing my helmet. I lied and told him it fell off and I lost it. Before heading home, I spoke with the manager, requesting that he audit the branch I was assigned to make sure the cashier finished his work on time. I couldn't stand going home late every night. Thankfully, the manager agreed, and from there on out, I was able to leave at 5 p.m., avoiding any more late-night drives. Even so, I knew that I needed to get out of this job soon, but I hoped nothing bad would happen before I could finally make my escape.
I have been watching a lot of your videos over the past few years, and I would love to share my story. My name is Raquel, and this happened to me several years ago when I was working in a call center. This incident took place in February 2016 at 3 in the morning. It was the end of my work week, and I was excited to go home. When I got home, I quickly realized I had forgotten my phone in my locker. After resting a bit, I left my things and just brought my wallet with me to go back to the office. The travel time usually takes 1 to 2 hours during peak hours, but I was able to arrive at the office within 30 to 40 minutes. I got my phone and left quickly. Since I really wanted to get home quickly, I decided to take a cab or taxi. After a while, a cab stopped in front of me. The light inside was so dim, but I didn't think much of it. I always take the front seat when riding a taxi, but this time, I'm not sure why, but I took the back seat. The taxi was driving for a few minutes, and I was just looking out the window and trying to be comfy. I noticed, though, that he had started slowing down near the bridge over the Pasig River. I looked at the driver, and he was short and had short black curly hair. He suddenly stopped the car and pointed a gun at me. "This is a holdup," he said. And I couldn't believe it. "Are you serious?" was my immediate response. He started shouting and cursing at me while pointing the gun. I slowly took my phone out and gave it to him. He snatched it and turned it off. I really didn't know what to do. "Now give me your wallet," he shouted, still pointing the gun at me. I slowly gave him my wallet, and he tried to grab it, but my hands wouldn't let go because I have important IDs in my wallet. My head was completely blank. My body acted for me, and I pulled my wallet as hard as I could and opened the door and tried to get out. He then started driving and turned sharp to try to pull me back inside the car, but thankfully, it did not work. The moment he stopped the car, I jumped out, ran, and started screaming for help. He shouted and drove in the opposite direction. I did not look back and just ran as fast as I could. I then saw a couple jogging and yelled for help. I told them what happened, and a policeman came and brought me to the nearest police station. I told the policeman what happened, and he said that the taxi I rode in had been stolen earlier that day and was reported as stolen by the real driver. The suspect's strategy was calling a taxi and then stealing it and pretending to be a taxi driver. After filing a police report, I stopped going to work that day and filed for resignation immediately. I also stopped riding in taxis for a couple of months and started looking for a job closer to my house. In April 2016, a friend from my previous workplace whose boyfriend is a policeman contacted me and said the hold-upper was captured and asked me to check the news. I was shocked when I saw the news. My friend asked me to go to the police station to give my statement. I said no, but she strongly advised me to do it. She said if I give a statement, it would add to that man's sentence. But I said that I wouldn't be able to because I was still suffering from the trauma of the incident and couldn't go outside. She respected my wishes, and we said goodbye. I couldn't tell her back then that the man they caught was not the guy who robbed me. That whole situation made me realize that there are more people.
About 20 years ago, I went on a camping trip with my friend Christian. At that time, we were both around 21 years old. To get to the camping site deep in the forest, we rode together in Christian's car. When we arrived, it was early evening, and we had a great time fishing and grilling meat. I went to sleep soon after we ate, but I woke up in the middle of the night because I needed to pee. I opened the tent and went outside. My eyes were drawn up to the bright moonlight. I walked over to the tree line and relieved myself, looking around to make sure nothing was nearby. As I was zipping up my pants, I saw a large, dark silhouette moving in the forest. I thought for a moment that it was a bear, and I was gripped by fear. But when I looked closely, it slowly became more visible in the darkness. It looked like a human figure, but it was incredibly big. He slowly approached me. When he came out of the forest and was illuminated by the moonlight, I could make out his appearance. He was at least twice my size and had a huge angular face like a primitive man. He was covered in fur and not wearing any clothes. More noticeable than anything else was that he was making a strange sound that I had never heard before. It was like a sharp sound made by strongly scraping his vocal cords. Every time I heard it, I felt goosebumps race across my whole body. His face was clearly a human face, and although it was hard to see because it was covered in fur, it looked like he was smiling. In his hands, he was holding large rocks. They were massive, around the size of basketballs. He was holding each of the enormous rocks with one hand. He didn't look to be straining at all, like they weren't heavy at all to him. He approached me slowly. I asked him who he was and what he needed, but he didn't seem to understand me. He seemed to be mumbling something, but it didn't sound like language. I felt an inexplicable sense of despair and fear rising from my stomach. The instant I looked into his eyes, my whole body became paralyzed. Before I could even think of anything, every cell in my body was overcome by fear. I had enough time to run to the tent, but my body wouldn't move. Looking back now, I think I already instinctively knew at that moment that there was nothing I could do. His physical ability was several times greater than mine, so even if I ran, he could catch up to me in a matter of seconds. And I knew that if I ran, I would provoke him even more. So there was nothing I could do. He was finally close enough to touch me. He looked at me curiously and felt the flesh on my arm. And then he pressed hard on my stomach with the back of his hand. It seemed as if he wanted to know what was inside my stomach. I pushed his hand away with everything in me, but he didn't move. He was like a statue. Meanwhile, Christian seemed to be sleeping soundly in the tent. Funnily enough, at that moment, I felt that even if I got eaten by that monster, I wanted Christian to survive. I wasn't a coward, I was a normal adult male, but I felt so small in front of that huge man. The creature in front of me didn't have the feel of a human. Standing before him was like being in front of a bear or a lion. I kept asking him what he wanted, but he didn't respond. Then after a while, he frowned and circled around me. He was still holding the rocks in his hands. I couldn't take my eyes off him for a second because I was afraid that he would hit me with the rock. Of course, I also simulated it countless times in my head. I imagined launching a surprise attack on him while he looked away from me. However, I had a gut feeling that he wouldn't budge even if I punched him. That's how big and strong he was. He circled around me once more and then slowly started to move away. And finally, seemed to lose interest in me. My head was dizzy as I watched him move away. I guess I was so scared that I couldn't breathe properly. He suddenly started running incredibly fast and disappeared into the forest. As I had intuited, his motor skills were several times greater than a human's, and his running speed was so fast that my eyes could barely keep up. I walked over to Christian's tent and woke him up. I told him what happened to me, but he seemed incredulous. But when he smelled that horrible stench coming from me and saw that I was drenched in sweat, he understood that something had really happened. We quickly packed up and drove away. I still don't know what the human or creature I saw that day was. What did he want from me? Was he trying to eat me? The answers to many of my questions remain unanswered, and I have never gone camping again since that day.
Unfortunately, or I should say, fortunately, this story is short. It was about 4 years ago. I'll keep the location vague for the sake of anonymity, but I will say it was in the northern half of Louisiana. I've lived here pretty much my whole life, and the few things I've ever experienced before this were at my father's house in Texas when I was younger, but that can be its own story. Anyway, I lived in an apartment complex about 30 to 40 minutes from where I worked. I was part of the evening shift at my job at the time. I would have to drive down a long, mostly empty road heading towards my home. This would last about 10 minutes before I had to head down a smaller, more rural suburban area. This is where it happened. It was probably a little past 11 or maybe even midnight, the usual time I got off for where I used to work. I was just driving, listening to either music or a podcast. I don't remember which. I was just really tired from work. I was relaxing and driving when my headlights illuminated something off to my right, in the ditch along the road. I only saw it for a few seconds, but I swear this pale creature, probably about 6 feet long, if not more, was sprawled out on the ground, crawling up out of the ditch, flat on its stomach. I only caught a glimpse, but I sometimes remember it having 6 limbs, other times 4. As I said, I was trying to pay more attention to the road, not expecting something like this. Either way, it startled me. I remember vividly seeing movement as I passed by, like it had crawled out of the drainage pipe and was about to head into the yard of the house I was passing. One of its long, thin, and lanky limbs reached up to place its right hand to pull itself up further. I passed it fast and did a double take, questioning what I'd seen. My mind was wondering if what I saw was real, or was I just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. Either way, I was not dumb enough to think about turning around to check it out. All the way back home, I kept driving and told myself it was just the weird way my headlights were making shadows on the rocks in the ditch. I even tried to recreate this effect for days, trying multiple ideas to recreate that effect, but never once did. Never did the shadows ever look the same as what I'd seen that night. Even trying to look out of the corner of my eyes, nothing. I asked my coworkers the following days if they'd ever seen anything like what I described, but to my dismay, they brushed it off, joking and asking, "Did you also see Bigfoot too?" I wish I could say I saw it again, but I didn't. But honestly, I'm glad. It means I can keep telling myself it had nothing to do with anything but my imagination. Even so, a small part of my mind says otherwise. The best description I have for what I saw that night are those things I've heard of about crawlers. Heck, I even started to follow groups online that talk about sightings like that now. I've told a few people about this. Most folks brush it off. To be honest, I still hope it was nothing more than my headlights and shadows. But you can never be too sure. If it really is out there, please never let me see you again. Ever.
Hi, I'm a 12th grade graduate, but this incident takes me back to my 9th grade days, when something really strange happened at our school. Imagine this, it was a normal day and we were in the middle of our 3rd period. Out of nowhere, 2 senior girls whose classroom was down the hall burst into our classroom, tears streaming down their faces. They were terrified and told our teacher, who had also been their teacher, that one of their classmates had tried to choke them in the girls' washroom. Our teacher wasted no time and rushed to the scene to investigate. They hurried to the washroom, only to find that the accused girl had somehow managed to get back into her classroom. The situation was chaos. The room was a complete mess, with books and pens scattered everywhere. The other students in her class were forced to leave, frightened and confused, not daring to go back inside. Now, here's where things get really weird. While all of this was happening, I was sitting in my classroom with my classmates thinking we were safe. But our curiosity got the best of us, and we couldn't resist peeking out to see what was happening in the seniors' classroom. Little did we know, we were about to witness something truly disturbing. As the teachers arrived, they discovered that the troubled girl had barricaded herself inside her classroom, refusing to open the door. Worried about her well-being, they immediately reached out to her mother, who shared the alarming news that her daughter had been struggling with mental health issues. She promised to come and take her daughter home. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity as we all waited anxiously. Finally, after what felt like ages, the teachers managed to force the door open as the locks were a bit loose, revealing a scene that sent shivers down our spines. There she sat, calm and composed on the ground. But here's the strange part. All the desks had been stacked up, one on top of another, forming a towering pile. These were not ordinary desks. They were heavy wooden desks that required the strength of 3 people to move. How on earth did she manage to stack them all by herself? It was baffling. When her mother arrived, the girl remained silent, not uttering a single word. They quickly took her to the hospital, where it was later discovered that she had a brain disorder that caused hallucinations and erratic behavior. It was a heartbreaking revelation that shed some light on the bizarre events we had witnessed. Even to this day, I can't forget that incident. I still question how a seemingly fragile girl could possess such strange strength and perform such a chilling act. It serves as a reminder that there are depths to the human mind that we may never fully understand, and horrors that can emerge from within. And with this incident, I owe a debt of gratitude to my friend that day. You see, I had a strange urge to use the washroom and asked my friend to come along for a quick chat, but she insisted we wait until the next period. Little did I know that her decision may have saved me from crossing paths with that troubled girl. It sends shivers down my spine when I imagine what might have happened to me.
I've been working as a police officer for more than 15 years in San Diego, California. More specifically, I was a police canine holder. There were some moments on the job where it was rough, but one moment made me see how excruciating the job really is. On March 3rd, 2022 at approximately 12:38 p.m., San Diego Police Department, which I was working at, received a request for urgent cover from the Sheriff's Department at a residence that was not too far from where we were. The request was that there was a woman who had been given paperwork because she had quite a bit of eviction notices. When the deputies tried to talk with the woman and tried to give her the paperwork, they saw a big knife in her hand. She wasn't listening, and she slammed her front door and shut it, and she barricaded it. That's when me, along with the other police officers, were called for backup. When we got to the given address, I, along with the K-9 unit, were told to wait outside of the lobby in case we were needed, which we were later called to enter the unit as an additional less lethal option. We got to the area, and one of the deputies broke down the door. I and some other officers walked through the door, and we went inside of the apartment. We were all calling for her to come out with her hands up, but she wouldn't listen. We were able to see the woman in the room with an open door, and one deputy officer named Jason. He kept shooting warning shots to the wall for her to obey and not to do this the hard way. Right in an instant, we saw the woman charging at us with a knife. We were backing up and out into the hallway, and Jason kept trying to shoot her, but he kept missing. When this didn't work, the woman swung the knife at us, which happened to land on my chest for a second or two, and then it was taken out. This prompted one of the other officers to shoot the woman. She was struck at least once, and she immediately was killed on the scene. I could barely move now. I was in so much pain. I screamed out that I got stabbed, but it seemed like no one acknowledged me just yet. Then like 5 seconds later, an officer asked if anyone was hurt, and I yelled out that I got stabbed once again. I was immediately rushed to the hospital, and I knew I wasn't going to die. I was fortunate enough to get treated for my stab wounds, and not too long after I was released from a medical center. I soon found out that the woman who stabbed me and got shot and killed was a 47-year-old woman. She was named Yan Lee. She had been getting a lot of eviction notices, but she kept refusing to accept it. She also apparently threatened one of the maintenance workers with a knife the previous day before she died. I was able to move on from this incident, but I'll never forget the feeling of having so much pain in your body that you think that you might not make it out alive. That's just the adventures of being a cop, I guess.
This chilling true story happened to my sister 5 years ago. Back then, we were both quite paranoid and gullible little kids and had no idea about the world's real dangers. But thanks to the safety of our town, we never really had to experience anything genuinely scary. It didn't really have a huge population back then. Everyone knew each other in the neighborhoods, and the atmosphere was peaceful and worry-free. There were no robberies, no illegal activities, no problems whatsoever as far as I was concerned. That's why this event shook me completely. My sister and one of her former best friends, who I'll be calling Becky, were going for a walk with my dog on their usual route. It was getting really late. The street lamps were pretty much the only thing illuminating the dark street, and our dog was feeling very thirsty, so they decided to take a shortcut back to our house. This particular shortcut went through dense trees and bushes, and of course, it had to pass by the cemetery. We were always cautious about taking this path, because it was very slippery after rain. But, as this happened during summer, there was no cause for concern. Our dog never likes to stay behind others, so this time she charged forward, and my sister and her friend had to pick up the pace to keep up. As they were getting closer to the end of the shortcut, the cemetery became more visible and more visible. Becky looked around and noticed something very strange which made her stop in her tracks. A woman in a white dress was sitting on her knees in front of a grave. Becky tapped my sister on her shoulder and pointed her finger towards the woman. Now they both stopped to look, but weirdly enough, my dog just wanted to continue walking. It was very unusual to see people there since the cemetery closes before dark, and the visibility in there was extremely low without another light source, and she didn't have one. As cautious and silly kids, they continued to stare, but eventually, as nothing happened, they continued walking, finally reaching the end of the path. Becky looked at the lady just one more time, and to her horror, she was standing and seemed to be staring off into the distance. She once again warned my sister about what she was seeing, and they both stopped to watch the woman again. My dog seemed to be unbothered, so she just sat down and waited for them to start walking again. Minutes passed and nothing happened, but they were scared to move. My sister eventually had enough, looked away, and whistled to our dog to stand up and begin walking. Just then, the woman turned around, broke out of the cemetery, and started running towards them at an insane speed. This is where I come into the story. Both of our parents were asleep by then. I had stayed up to play video games and to make sure everyone would arrive okay. While running, my sister calls me.
Open the front door now, and wake up Mom and Dad.
What? What happened?
There's a woman chasing us. What? I think we lost her, but...
I immediately rushed to our parents' room and woke them up, told them everything, and opened the front gate. I put on my slippers and ran outside to see where they could be. I thankfully saw them in the distance. They were okay. We all went inside and talked things through. My dad took Becky back to her house while my sister told me and my mom everything. There was a lot of scolding after that, but it was totally fair. She said that after the lady began the pursuit, they all ran as fast as they could, trying not to stumble on anything. Becky was able to look back at the woman and see her move clearly when she was under the street lamps. She said she ran so unnaturally and never stumbled once, even though she was supposedly in heels. And the white dress didn't have any stains, it was completely clean. Nothing made sense about her, but the freakiest thing of all was that our dog, who acts extremely aggressively against any kind of threats due to accidents with other dogs in the past, never barked, growled, or seemingly saw her at all. To this day, I have no idea if this was something related to the supernatural. Nothing else happened after this occurrence, but my sister sometimes still has nightmares about her encounter with this woman. Sometimes the woman even catches up to her, but she always wakes up before what happens next.
Even now, when I think about that time, it feels so horrible. I've tried to live without thinking about it again, because when I do, I feel so terrified that I can't do anything. But for the sake of sharing this story, I'll recall that hellish time one last time. It was 6 years ago when I met a man named Cameron. At first, I thought he was a good person. He ran a flower shop and always carried flowers with him. But when I found out why he liked flowers so much, it was already too late. I started dating him, and every time we met, he gave me a bouquet of flowers. The flowers were always of the best quality. They were all beautiful and carefully selected. One day, as he handed me a bouquet, he picked out a few flowers and broke them. Confused, I asked him why. He said, "They're not pretty. I get angry when I see ugly things." His expression suddenly turned murderous. I was startled by the change in his face and froze. Then he looked at me and said, "Why? You're pretty. Don't worry. I won't break you." As he said this, he grabbed my shoulder. His hand felt unnaturally strong. I remembered how he often did arm exercises with dumbbells when there weren't any customers in the shop. Suddenly, I started to feel scared of him. Seeing the fear on my face, he leaned in and whispered quietly, "All you have to do is stay pretty without withering. So please smile. You look ugly with that frowning expression." Then he smiled brightly again and handed me a bottle of water. "Your skin needs hydration. Drink water," he said. That's when I realized he was a psychopath. Goosebumps covered my skin, and I decided I needed to end things with him immediately. Before our next date, I called two friends, Adam and Jonathan, and asked them to watch me from a distance and to help if anything goes wrong. I explained the situation, and they agreed to help. They waited in their car near Cameron's house, ready to intervene when I gave them the signal. When I arrived at Cameron's doorstep, I rang the doorbell. He told me to come inside, but I refused to enter. He came to the front door, confused, and asked me what was wrong. That's when I told him we needed to break up. For a moment, he seemed surprised and stood silently for about 5 seconds. Then, with a bitter smile, he said, "When you say that, you look so ugly right now." Slowly, he raised his hands and grabbed my neck. His grip was incredibly strong. "You were such a pretty flower," he said. "Why did you suddenly change? I told you, I didn't want to break your neck." He loosened his grip slightly and whispered softly, "I'll give you one last chance. Do you really want to break up with me, or will you be my flower again?" With a trembling voice, I told him we should break up. Suddenly, he screamed, "I'll kill you!" Grabbing my head with both hands, he started breathing heavily, as if mentally preparing to snap my neck. I screamed for help as loud as I could. At that moment, Adam and Jonathan heard my screams. They ran to me, tackled Cameron to the ground, and restrained him while calling the police. Cameron was arrested, and I later learned that he had done the same thing to his ex-girlfriends. One of his ex-girlfriends had her neck snapped, and she barely survived. Cameron had used his wealth to pay her a huge settlement and avoid severe punishment. This time, Cameron went to prison, and I was lucky to escape with my life. 5 years later, I received even more horrifying news. A friend of Cameron's contacted me and told me that after he was released from prison, he killed another woman and was sentenced to life in prison. Apparently, he had found a new girlfriend. One day, they had a fight, and he snapped her neck. Afterward, he called his friend, crying, and said, "I broke a flower." When the police arrived, they found the woman's body in a bathtub full of water, her neck completely broken. Cameron was pouring water over her head and stroking her hair. When I heard that story, I was so shocked that I had to see a psychiatrist for a while. Even now, I often wonder, what would have happened to me if Adam and Jonathan hadn't been there that day? They saved my life, and I will never forget how grateful I am to them.
My name is Nikayla Morales, and today I'll be telling you a story that still haunts me to this very day. I was about 10 to 11 years old. Me and my friends are on a hiking trip to explore the woods. Personally, I wasn't a fan of hiking, but I went along because I wanted to hang out with my friends. At one point, my friend, we'll call her Cassie, and I had to pee, so our friends found a public restroom nearby in the woods that looked pretty abandoned. I, of course, was a bit hesitant at first, because it was slightly eerie, but Cass saw me starting to turn back and said, "Would you rather use the porta potty?" Since I would rather die than use one of those, we both reluctantly went inside the bathroom. It was hell. There was trash everywhere, bugs crawling on the walls, and it smelled so bad that we both had to cover our noses. We reluctantly walked to the stalls and each went into one. My stall was somewhat clean looking, but the smell was still terrible. I didn't dare sit on the toilet, so I decided to squat and, do my business. After we were done, we went to wash our hands, but we really didn't want to because the sinks were just as bad as the rest of the bathroom. The sink was stained black and the faucet had mildew all over it. Luckily, I looked in my bag and found some hand sanitizer. But then, as we were using it, we heard the door shut. We both immediately went over to open it, but it was locked. We tried calling out to our friends outside, but they couldn't hear us. Cass started panicking, and I tried my best to calm her down. Not even 2 seconds later, she said she had to puke and ran towards the stalls. I hear the stall door creak open, and then Cass screams at the top of her lungs. I went over to see what was going on, and I found her on the floor, curled into a ball and shaking. I asked what was wrong, but she briefly glanced up at the stall door. I opened the door, and what I saw was so shocking that I fell back onto the ground. Inside the stall was a rotting body, with ants crawling in and out of the toilet and maggots sprouting from the body. Seeing the body was disturbing, but somehow the stench was even more traumatizing. Suddenly, we heard the door unlock. A police officer walked in, but we didn't take time to greet him. We just immediately ran outside. We explained everything we had seen to him, and later they removed the body and took us home. Since the body had no identification, it was buried in an unmarked grave. To this day, I still wonder what happened to that guy, and who, or what, locked the door on us.
Hi, Wansee. I wanted to share my true story with you. I'm 30 years old now, but this happened when I was around 24. My mom and dad decided to move into a newly built house. The house was the first in a row, followed by another set of about 4 houses. At the end of our row, there was a giant empty space with a large, steep hill. Nothing except extra parking had been built there. This detail will be relevant later. After about a year, my parents ended up separating, and my mom moved out. So it was just me, my dad, and my brother, who was in his last year of college. I had already graduated and was home more often than the two of them. They also had to get up early for school and work, so I would typically be up at night later than them. One night, at around 2 o'clock, I went downstairs to get a glass of water from the kitchen. To avoid disturbing my family, I decided to use my phone as a flashlight instead of turning on the lights. Aside from the glow from my phone, the house was really dark. I knew my dad and brother were both asleep in their beds, but when I reached the first landing, I heard someone running from one end of the kitchen to the living room. It was loud. Our house had an open floor plan, and the hardwood floors amplified any noise. Panicked, I quickly ran the rest of the way down the stairs and turned on the lights, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I was confused, but just shrugged it off, got my water, and went back to bed. That wasn't the only incident. A month or 2 later, I was home alone. I'd spent the day reading and watching videos until I noticed it was getting late. Around 6 in the evening, I texted my dad and brother, asking when they'd be home. Both replied they'd be working late. I sighed and continued watching YouTube videos in bed to pass the time. Suddenly, I felt my entire bed shake violently. It wasn't an earthquake. My dresser and bookshelf didn't move. We live near a military base that often does weapons testing, but even that wouldn't have caused my bed to shake so forcefully. Normally, we just hear noise from the base. My bed sits on wooden slats, and those slats have fallen before. But when that happens, you can only feel it if you're sitting on the mattress. This was different. The shaking was visible and could have been seen from anywhere in the room. Freaked out, I called my boyfriend in a panic. To this day, I still don't have an explanation for what happened. The last strange thing that happened before I moved out occurred during the early morning hours. I work at a coffee shop and had to leave around 5 a.m. to open at 5:30. By this time, my stepmom and both of my stepsisters had moved in, so parking in the driveway was crowded. I had to park in the overflow area near the empty space with the steep hill and overgrown bushes. As I was walking to my car, I passed the empty area. Suddenly, I heard someone call my name, clear as day. I stopped and looked to my left, but I didn't see anything or anyone. Just pitch black darkness. Terrified, I sprinted the rest of the way to my car and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. Believe me or not, I'm convinced that house is haunted. My dad still lives there, but he says he hasn't had any experiences like I did.
Not long ago, maybe 1 or 2 months ago, I went through something strange. I sleep in the family living room because there's no TV in my bedroom, and I love watching TV until I fall asleep. I lay out a mattress in front of the TV every night. One night, around 12:30 a.m., I hadn't fallen asleep yet. The TV was still playing, and I was chatting with my boyfriend while scrolling on TikTok. From where I sleep, I face my mother's bedroom, but I can't see her bed or her directly. Just the wardrobe facing me, the TV cabinet, and the wall-mounted TV on the left. On the right, I can only see a small part of my parents' bed. That night, I was still giggling while texting my boyfriend. The last thing I heard was my mom's voice as she video called my dad. Not long after that, I heard what sounded like my mom crying. I'm the type of daughter who gets too embarrassed to ask my parents what's wrong or what's going on. So I just lay there, quietly, listening to the sound of crying. At first, I doubted what I was hearing.
Is she really crying? What did my dad do this time?
I wasn't sure if it was real. I turned the TV volume down and put my phone aside to focus on the sound. As I listened more closely, the crying became clearer. I started to believe that my mom was really crying. Feeling confused, I told my boyfriend right away. I messaged him.
Hey, I hear my mom crying. What should I do?
He insisted that I check on her. Still unsure, I replied,
Are you sure I should check? The crying sounds vague yet clear. I'm not really sure if she's crying or not.
But he kept insisting, so I decided to investigate. I got up from my mattress and walked to the bathroom, which is right beside my mom's bedroom. I didn't go into the bathroom, I just stood near the door to listen more closely. As I stood there, the crying sound became even more apparent. That's when I decided to check on my mom. When I finally looked at her, she was sound asleep. I could tell because she was snoring softly. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell? Was that crying sound all in my head? I went back to my mattress and texted my boyfriend.
My mom is asleep. She wasn't crying.
My boyfriend doesn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. He replied,
Maybe you're sleepy and hearing things.
But I wasn't sleepy at all. I was wide awake, and I had been carefully listening to that crying sound for minutes. There's no way it was just my imagination. Oddly enough, once I returned to my mattress, the crying sound completely stopped. I didn't hear it again. Maybe my mom really was crying earlier, but stopped when I checked on her because she was embarrassed, I thought. I decided I would ask her about it in the morning. When morning came, I asked her directly, Mom, were you crying last night? She looked confused and said no. What? I was even more confused. My mom believes in spiritual things like I do, so I told her,
I heard you crying from your bedroom last night. I made sure I wasn't hearing things multiple times, and it sounded so real. But when I checked on you, you were already asleep. And after I went back to my mattress, the sound was gone.
My mom was just as shocked as I was. I asked her again to make sure she hadn't been crying. She assured me that if she'd been crying or had a problem with my dad, she would have told me. To this day, I'm still confused about what happened that night. That crying voice sounded so real, there's no way it was just my imagination.